Bob Zarrole is one of the most viewed React instructors in the world. And now he's back with a brand new complete React course that will teach you modern React using patterns like functional components and hooks. If you want to learn the React JavaScript library, this is the video.
Hey free code campers, welcome to my newest course on learning React. In this course, you're going to solve over 140 different coding challenges and work on 8 different projects, all of which have an associated Figma design file to guide your work. And you actually have 2 options for following along. Either by using your local machine, I actually have a few lessons that'll show you how to do that starting pretty early in this course. Or you can head over to Scrimba.com where there's an interactive version of this course so that you can solve the challenges directly in your browser. It's totally up to you what you want to do. The link to the course on Scrimba.com is provided below. And actually, this course is part of a larger front-end career path, which we have at Scrimba, which takes people from zero to hireable as a front-end developer. This course is module 11 in that career path, and my more advanced React course immediately follows this free React course as module 12, where I go even more in depth into React, React Router, using the Context API, and so much more. If those topics sound confusing to you, don't worry at all. You don't need to take them to understand this course. Now, I always appreciate any feedback you have for me about the course, so you're welcome to reach out to me on Twitter at Bob Zarrole, or if you have any questions about your specific code, the best place for those is to either reach out to the Free Code Camp forums or Discord server, or you can check out Scrimba's own Discord server, which is becoming a more and more deeply integrated part of the whole Scrimba.com experience. And with that, good luck and have a ton of fun learning React.
Hey there, and welcome to the Learn React module. I'm super excited you're joining me for this course because by the end you'll have built not 1, not 2, but at least 8 projects using React. There's so many of them, I don't even have time to go over each one of them in detail right now. I could barely even fit them on this slide. So why are we doing so many projects? Well, it's because I designed the curriculum for this course to be project-driven. In each of the sections, we will start with a goal project that we are working toward, and then we'll learn everything we need in order to build that project. Now, in order for that approach to actually work, I'm going to be asking a lot from you. So let's talk for just a bit on how you can get the most from this course. Just like everything in life, what you put into this course is what you will get out of it. Or as I like to say, my philosophy about learning is that the easiest way to learn something is to do it the hard way. In this course, I'm going to be asking you to do a lot of the work. For much of it, you'll have me there after each challenge to walk you through a solution, but for some of it, you won't. Either way, what I'm asking of you now is to avoid the trap of tutorial hell, where you end up passively watching me do all the work. Remember, this is not school. You're presumably here because you actually want to finish the course with the ability to write React code by yourself. School has taught a lot of us that the goal of learning is to get a good grade. In fact, I heard something really interesting that said that education is the only thing that humans try to get less out of than what they paid for. So don't let that be you in this course. If you really give it everything you've got, meaning you do all the challenges and projects, you're involved with the community, and you are an active participant in your own learning, I can promise that you'll probably finish off in a better spot than many students getting their degree in computer science. And I really don't say that lightly. Along those lines, remember that spaced learning and repetition are your best friends. Binging the course from beginning to end, even if you are doing all the assignments, is kind of like trying to run an ultra marathon without training. Your brain actually needs rest, so take breaks often. By taking this course, the goal isn't just to get to the end, it's to get to the end with some honest-to-goodness React skills. Then after you come back to this course on maybe the next day, don't be afraid to re-watch some of the past lessons and even redo some of the past challenges. Because repetition really is your best friend whenever you're trying to learn something new. So what should you already know coming into this course? Before jumping into React, you should have a solid grasp of the fundamentals of web development, namely HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and preferably a pretty solid understanding of the new syntax that was introduced back in ECMAScript 6, ES6, and above. If you're feeling at all rusty on any of these topics, you can click the logo for each one of these, which will send you to another free course here on Scrimba, where you can brush up on those skills. My name is Bob Zarol. I'm going to be your instructor throughout this whole course. My username pretty much everywhere online is Bob Zarol, but these days I'm really most active on Twitter. You can click the Twitter icon to go to my profile if you want to follow me. That would be great. And so without any further delay, let's jump right in and start learning React. In the first section of this course, we're going to be learning everything we need in order to build a basic static page using React. And I know what you might be thinking, but I already know how to make static web pages. I know you're probably super excited to really dive in and learn dynamic web applications with React, and we are going to get there in this course. But in order to start off, this section is all about learning the basic syntax and you could say the vocabulary of React. Because I found that the best approach to learning React is to first start learning how to think in React. The reason for this is because React really does kind of change the game in terms of how you build applications. Later in this section, we are going to start learning the differences between declarative and imperative programming, and you're going to find that React approaches web development in a completely different way. So the point is, we're first going to be dialing in our brains to start thinking in terms of using React to build websites by first building some static web pages, not unlike the ones that you normally would just use HTML and CSS for. So this might not seem terribly exciting right now, but I think you'll soon see that writing composable, reusable components in React can actually be a bit addicting and pretty fun. So I know that you'll find a lot of benefit in starting off with the milk before we get to the meat, or of course we have a vegetarian option as well. The content in this section will be driven forward by the goal of creating our first static web page in React. And that's the page you see here in the screenshot that has a list of fun facts about React. Now, this screenshot is actually also a link to the Figma file for the design of this page. So if you click this screenshot, it will open up in Figma. You'll have to make sure that you log into your Figma account. If you don't have one yet, it's free to create. And clicking the screenshot will lead you to a sort of shared file that everyone will have access to. In that shared file, you'll see something near the top that looks kind of like this, where it's got React facts and then this little drop-down arrow. Your best bet is going to be to click that drop-down arrow, go over to duplicate to your drafts, and click that. Duplicating this design to your own drafts is going to make it possible for you not only to edit the design if you want to change it a little bit, but also to help you avoid any distraction you might see on the design page of anybody else's cursors or maybe some comments that they may have left. So I'll go back to this design here. Make sure to click on it now so at least the URL gets saved up in your tabs in your browser. And lastly, we're going to look at the different topics that we'll be covering in this section. So what are we going to learn about? Well, first we're going to learn why we even care about React in the first place. I think knowing why React is so exciting and so popular will help make your learning journey of React a much simpler one because you'll be so excited about what you'll be able to create in the end by using React. We'll also be talking about a proprietary React syntax called JSX, and we'll get to see how that sort of changed the game for React and made writing React a much more familiar experience. Then we'll dive into creating custom components, and you'll learn all about what that means and how to actually do that yourself in React. And of course, in order to build our project, we're going to need to know how to apply CSS styling. Again, the goal is for us to be able to build this simple static page in React. I'm really excited for us to get started. So without any further ado, let's jump right into the deep end and start writing our first React code. Before we just jump right into theory and why we care about React and how all the little pieces of React work, I want to get your hands on the keyboard typing some React code as soon as possible, mostly just to show you that React is not a scary library to be working with. So let's see how we can set up React. Now, I like to think of there as being an easy way to set up React in your project and a correct way of setting React up in your project. For our sake in learning, we're going to start with the easy way, which will also make it so that you can actually just do this in your local environment. Hopefully you're following along here on Scrimba.com, but if you're curious and you're interested, you can always do this on your local environment as well. Now you can see I have a very basic HTML page set up. I have nothing in my JavaScript at all. My CSS is minimal, and we're going to walk through this together. Now I have some slides here, And you can actually click on this screenshot and that will send you to this exact page. In the React documentation, it tells you how you can include React into your project. And we can actually pull in these libraries that we need straight from a CDN. In other words, we can just copy these two script tags here and start writing React code. There's a little more to it, but what I'm going to do is click here, and that's going to open me up to the React page. I'm just going to copy the two script tags that you can see. And over in my index.html, I'm going to put it in the head here. Let me fix the indentation. And I've pulled in the React library and another library called React DOM. Theoretically, this is all I need in order to start writing some React code. Now, I'm going to take it one step further, and that's because just pulling in React and React DOM is going to be pretty extremely limiting in terms of using the power of React, unless we also pull in something called Babel. I'm not going to jump in too deep into why we need to pull in Babel. For now, all I'm going to do is click on this screenshot here, which will take me again to a page where I can copy the script tag that you see. And I will paste that in underneath this script tag. And if we look really closely below here, it says you can use any JSX. We'll cover what JSX is later in any script tag by adding type equals text/Babel. So I'm going to do that here in my script tag down here. Type equals text/Babel. And that's all the setup we really need. By pulling in the React-DOM library in this script tag, I now have access to a global variable called React DOM. I'm going to use that to render something to the screen. Once again, I'm going to be covering everything that we're talking about here. It's totally okay if this is moving pretty quickly. React-DOM.render allows me to render something that looks very much like HTML. Now, this might be blowing your mind a little bit because this probably looks a little strange writing some HTML inside of my JavaScript. We're going to see how this is kind of one of the beautiful things that React has added so that we can write really declarative code. Now, let's put something inside this H1 that's meaningful. We had hello React over here. Maybe I'll say hello everyone. Okay, in my index.html, I'm going to get rid of this H1 so we're not confusing this H1 with what I'm seeing over here. Now, React-DOM.render, the first thing is what do I want to render to the screen? The second thing is where do I want to render it? Well, let's go to our HTML and I'm going to create a div here. Just a completely empty div, and I'm going to give it an ID so that I can select it. We'll call it root because this is going to be like the root of our entire application. I like to think of this div as a container for the entire website that we're going to build in React. And now that I have a place where I can put my H1 here, I'm going to select it with a regular DOM API document.getElementById root. And surprise, we've written some React code. I'm going to hit save. We'll see that it tells me, hello, everyone. In a single line of code, I was able to use React to insert something that looks very much like an H1. Obviously, this is a little different because we're still inside JavaScript. And I was able to put it right inside of this real DOM element in our index.html. Now, I have an entire lesson that's dedicated to understanding exactly what's going on here. But in an effort to get your hands on the code, get a quick win for you to see that you can write React and it's not too scary, I'm going to give you a few seconds of silence where you can pause the screencast and study this line of code, and then I'll be erasing it and letting you type it again from scratch. In fact, let me write that down as a little challenge here. Okay, pause the screencast here, spend just a minute memorizing this line of code. Do that now. And then I will add a little comment with the next part. Okay, your time to shine. Rewrite the line of code as best you can from memory. You don't have to put hello everyone or hello React or whatever. You even don't have to use an H1 like I did. You can put whatever HTML you want in there. So pause the screencast now and work on that. Because I pulled in that React DOM library in my CDN, I have a global variable called React DOM, and it has a render method, which allows us to render something to the screen, or kind of, in other words, place something on the screen. And I don't know, let's do a paragraph this time, just to switch it up a tiny bit. Say, hi, my name is Bob. Okay, so that's the element that I want to place inside of this div. Again, this div is a container for the actual elements that I plan on putting on the screen. And the second parameter that I need to include with React DOM.render is, you could think of it as a DOM node that I have to go select with document.getElementById, or because I can also get DOM nodes with something like query selector, that would work just as well. In this case, I'd have to put #root because that's how query selector works. It's the ID of root. Just so this isn't confusing, we'll just keep it as getElementById for now, but just so you know, either one should work just fine. So the first parameter is what do I want to place on the screen, and the second one is where should I be placing this? I imagine under the hood, what render is doing is it's taking this DOM element that we are grabbing with getElementById, and it's running something similar to .append or .appendChild to it. And what is it appending? It's appending this paragraph. We're going to see that it's a little more complicated than that, but that's a good way to kind of build a mental model for yourself as to how this is actually working. So I haven't refreshed the page yet, which is why this still says hello everyone. I'm going to hit save, which will refresh my browser, and there we go. Hi, my name is Bob. This time it's a paragraph instead of a header element, and that's awesome. We have written React in a single line of code. You might have noticed that our console is popping up with this error. You're using the in-browser Babel transformer. Be sure to pre-compile your scripts for production. A bunch of jargon here that may not totally make sense to you. And that's fine. That's a symptom of us setting up React the easy way instead of the correct way. Soon down the road, we'll be kind of shifting our setup here, and that warning will go away. And awesome. Okay, because this is Scrimba, you can always delete this. If maybe you weren't able to memorize that, you can try deleting it, rewriting it again from scratch. Practice with it. I'm going to ask you to do that a million times throughout this course because the only way to learn React is to write React as much as you can. Now, I have found it really helpful for my own learning to understand why the heck I even care about React in the first place. So in the next couple screencasts, we're going to be talking about some of those really awesome benefits that come with using React as our library for building web applications. But as always, if you want to spend more time with this, go ahead and do that. Pause, click into the editor, start typing what you want to type, practice it. And when you're ready, I will see you in the next lesson. Surprise! If you know my teaching style, I wanted to include a practice in here. Essentially, you're just going to be rewriting that same line of code that we just wrote in the last lesson. However, this time we'll extend it just a little bit. I want you to see if you can figure out how to render an unordered list with 2 or more list items inside. Last time we just rendered a paragraph. You can see it's still kind of left over here. If I refresh that, that'll disappear. I've left the entire setup here for you. We're still pulling in the script tags for React, React DOM, and Babel. So essentially your main focus is just to rewrite that same one-liner of code, but see if you can figure out how to add a couple more elements inside, like having an unordered list with some nested list items. Pause here and try to work on that challenge. Okay, pulling in the React DOM library that gives us access to a render method. Before we did a simple paragraph like this and put some code inside. However, I can put this as an unordered list and then just actually stick some list items inside of here. So it's going to look a little confusing at first. I'll clean it up in just a minute. We have list item, we'll just say thing 1, and I'll do another list item here. Thing 2. Okay. Now I'm going to move this onto its own line here, this whole HTML thing right there. And the second parameter I need to separate with a comma is where to put this. So I'm going to use document.getElementById root. And let's cross our fingers, see how this goes. Cool. Okay. Hopefully that was some good practice. Now let's keep moving forward and learn a little bit more about why we care about React. One more thing that was highly requested from the first time I recorded this React course was how can I set this up on my local environment? Everything that I'm doing will be done on Scrimba.com so that you can interact with the same code that you see me writing. However, it's also a good experience to run it locally on your own computer and get a feel for what it would be like to actually develop React on your own computer. Again, our setup here is more of the easy way than the right way, but for now what you can do is you can click the little gear icon in the lower right of your Scrimba editor, which will pop up a little menu here, and there's an option that says download as zip. That will download a zip file containing the files that we're working on here. You can uncompress that like you normally would any zip file and open that up in any editor that you'd like, for example, Visual Studio Code on your own machine. Now, in order for that to run, I'm going to show you what that looks like on Visual Studio Code. Inside of Visual Studio Code, which is what you see in this screenshot, there's a menu icon for some extensions, and you'll need to search for an extension called Live Server. It's created by Ritwik Day, and you'll need this installed to your VS Code in order to run the code that we have written in React. So you'll click the little install button. That's going to put an icon down at the very bottom menu bar in Visual Studio Code that says Go Live. And all you need to do is click that Go Live button, which will open a web page on a local server. I think it's maybe port 5000 that it runs. And that should launch your own React project on your local machine. As soon as you see me move toward a different setup for React that includes Webpack and downloaded dependencies from NPM and so forth, this is no longer going to work in quite the same way. But for now, for those that are curious, I thought I might just explain how you can get this set up on your own machine. Okay, that's enough delaying. Let's keep moving forward with the course. Let's spend a little bit of time understanding why we even care to learn React. One of the main reasons that people will talk about is how React allows us to write composable code. So what exactly do I mean by composable? Well, an analogy that I came up with has to do with sculpting. If you think of the statue of David, for example, this statue was created originally from a single giant block of marble that was then sculpted down to the sculpture that we know today. So in the end, what results is one giant single piece that makes up this piece of art. Now, what if instead of starting with one giant piece, we instead used a bunch of small pieces to put together something that is greater? These are Lego bricks that obviously are small, each in their own right, that were put together to create something large. In this example, they all kind of work together to accomplish a goal, so to speak, the goal of looking like the statue of David. Now, this example is not perfect because the original statue of David obviously is more beautiful than this replica made of Lego bricks. But hopefully the concept makes sense. Let's look at an example in actual web development. What I have here is copy and pasted from the Bootstrap website. If you're not familiar with Bootstrap, that's really not important right now, but it's enough to know that these 30 or 40 lines of code, copy and pasted from the Bootstrap website, represent a navigation bar that is pre-styled. Now, in the old days of web development, a single page on a website was usually a single HTML page. So if this is just the nav bar, a lot of times those web pages would end up being thousands and thousands of lines of HTML code, essentially making it one giant sculpture. Well, with modern frameworks like React, we can take code like this and we can put it into our own custom components. And we can put those components together to make something that is larger. But in our case, our code becomes a lot more maintainable and a lot more flexible. You can see I've given these kind of silly names to show you that these are not regular HTML elements. I can combine elements together that are real HTML elements, like you see here, into my own custom component called, for example, my awesome navbar or my awesome footer. We're not quite ready to dive into the syntax of React quite yet, but I'm going to give you a taste of it and a chance to play with it before we move on. So let's see this in practice. Over here you can see I have my React DOM.render and I'm rendering a custom component called navbar. And if I scroll up, you'll get a chance to see how I created that navbar. As a quick aside, one thing you might notice is that I'm using class name everywhere instead of class. That's not a mistake, that's just how you have to assign classes in React. We're going to cover that later. But for now, I'd like to give you a challenge that's going to require you to deduce what I've done here and try to replicate it for yourself. So let me put that here. Okay, your challenge is to see the navbar component that I have created and see if you can deduce how to create your own component called main content. It can return something really simple like a single H1 element, and afterwards I want you to render it below the navbar. You'll have to figure out how to render it below the navbar. Now, I've changed this a little bit for reasons that we'll talk about soon. But this line here, 51, this is where you're going to figure out how to render your own custom component main content. So first, build your custom component, looking at my example above to try and figure out how to do that. And secondly, render that component down here in React DOM.render. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Well, following the example above, we see that I created this component by creating a function. and the name of the function is the name of my component. So I will open up that function and return the content that I want to show up on my page. Above, I created a set of parentheses because I have many elements that I'm trying to return. I'll just do that just to keep things consistent for now. We'll create our H1 that says I'm learning React. And secondly, I can take my main content and I can render it by making it look kind of like an HTML element. In this case, it's a self-closing one, so I have main content as a single tag here. And if I hit save, we'll see that my H1 actually showed up on my page. And that's the concept of composability. It goes quite a bit deeper than this. We're going to see how we can make our components much more composable and reusable. But for now, let's move on to another reason why people really love React. And we'll cover that in the next lesson. Another major reason people love React is because it's something that we call declarative. So let's talk about declarative. To understand declarative, it's helpful to know that its opposite is something called imperative. When a program is declarative, we can simply tell it what should be done. More specifically, it's like the computer saying, just tell me what to do and I'll worry about all the nitty-gritty details on how to get it done. Its opposite, imperative, is when we need to tell the program how it should be done. Like the computer saying, I need you to describe to me every step along the way how to do something, and then I'll do it. Up until now, if you've mostly been just using vanilla JavaScript anytime you needed to create elements on the page, you've been doing it in an imperative way. In fact, let's go look at what that has been like. I've commented out my React DOM.render, and I'm going to put a challenge here for you. Okay, your challenge is to recreate this above line of code where we are rendering something to the screen using vanilla JavaScript by creating and appending an H1 to our div with the ID of root. We have our div ID of root. You'll need to select it and then append a new element. And I give you the step-by-step instructions right here. One little caveat is I don't want you using inner HTML because that kind of breaks the analogy down a little bit. Generally speaking, this is actually just a good way to practice the vanilla JavaScript that you have been learning so far, so it's always good to give it some practice. I'll give you a couple lines here, pause the screencast, and work on this challenge. Okay, let's work on this. So I'm going to create an H1, and I'll use document.createElement, and I'll make an H1. And then if I'm giving it some text content, I need to use the text content property of this DOM node and set it equal to, I don't know, maybe this is an imperative way to program. Then I need to give it a class name, so I'll use the class name property here and set it equal to, I think we said header. And finally, I need to append it to my div with the ID of root. So first I need to say document get element by ID root, and then use the append property or method to append my H1 to the DOM. So when I hit save, it should show up. This is an imperative way to program. Perfect. Now this example's a little bit on the nose because if you were really just putting something static that had nothing to do with user interaction, you probably would just go to your HTML page and stick it right inside the div here, right? But with React, we're building our entire page in JavaScript. And so doing something imperatively this way, where I have to tell it step by step how to create the element and then to add some text content and then add a class name and then append it to the DOM, that's going to get old pretty fast, especially even with something mildly more complicated than a single H1, like a very simple web page like this. As soon as we have more than one element, suddenly our 4 lines of code will become probably dozens or maybe even hundreds of lines of JavaScript code just to create and append all of these elements in the correct order and in the correct way. And so that brings us back to the idea of writing our code declaratively, and React allows us to do that in a really simple way. As we see back up top, when we comment this out and uncomment this, we essentially get to write our JavaScript as if it were HTML. We are relying on React to figure out how to turn what we have declaratively written as an H1 into the JavaScript code that's needed to append it to the DOM. In fact, if I were being strict and wanted to make this more equivalent, in order to add a class name, I can just add a class name as if this were an HTML element. Again, this is class name instead of class for a good reason, which we'll talk about. But that's a pretty minor difference to be able to do all of these lines of code in one single section right here. And that difference is going to compound as we get into more and more complicated UIs like we see here. So at this point, I could probably continue talking about different reasons that we're choosing to use React and that it will be really beneficial for you to learn React. As you see on my little list here, it's a very hireable skill and it's actively maintained by really skilled people at Facebook. However, at this point, I think we're overdue to just jump into the syntax, get your hands on the keyboard, and start learning and practicing React. So when you're ready, let's keep moving forward. Okay, let's finally address this elephant in the room, what we're looking at here, why we have what looks like HTML stuffed right inside our JavaScript. Well, fairly early on in the days of React, the React team created a syntax that's called JSX. JSX stands for JavaScript XML, but that's not terribly important for you to memorize. What's most important is to think of it as sort of a flavor of JavaScript that looks a lot like HTML. And with the introduction of JSX into React, it really made it so that React was very declarative instead of imperative. We can see up above what it took for us to create an H1, give it some text content, and give it a class name in regular vanilla JavaScript. But with JSX, the benefit is that we can just write what we're already used to writing with HTML. Now there's a couple of small differences. For example, instead of using class, I need to use class name. So I might say class name equals header, for example. And there's a few other of these, but for the most part, with JSX, we can just write the HTML that we're used to writing. At first, it might be a little bit confusing to write your HTML inside of your JavaScript, but I promise as you start doing React, it's really going to start making sense. You're going to learn to love JSX. Now, one thing that was really helpful for me to understand as I was learning was to see the difference between what JSX is and what our regular DOM elements are. So I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to uncomment these lines of code here, and I'm also going to take this piece of JSX and set it to a variable. We'll call it element. Then I can fix my React DOM.render by just putting element down here, and this will work exactly the same. But this allows us to console log it. So let's console log element, and I'll hit save so that this code will run. I'll open the console, and we'll see the differences here. First of all, on line 4, we are console logging the DOM element that we created with document.createElement. And that's what shows up in our console as what looks like an HTML element here. So that's this line right here. However, when we console log our element that we created with JSX, what actually got returned to us was this. And let me copy this out. And we can see that this is just a regular JavaScript object. Let me clean it up just a little bit to make it even more clear. So in the end, what we get from JSX, or rather what React is creating with JSX, is actually just plain old JavaScript objects. And those objects describe the DOM element that we want React to put onto the page for us. And if we look closely, we can see some interesting information here. First of all, we see that it has very similar properties, like we have class name, where we're setting that to header. And down here we have props, or short for properties, and we have class name. We also have something called children, and we can see that's actually the text that we put inside of our H1. That's about all I care to touch on with the object nature of React elements, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of kick us off understanding that JSX is kind of like a function that when it's run, returns us objects that React can interpret and use to create actual elements that get put on the screen for us. I'm going to comment this out so we can talk about one more thing, clean up this a little bit. And I'll go ahead and put this directly back in line to my React DOM.render, move these onto their own lines. The last thing that I wanted to touch on was that with JSX, we need to make sure that we are only returning a single parent element. In other words, I can't take this one H1 and place, say, a paragraph directly next to it. because in this case, we're rendering or attempting to render two sibling elements that sit side by side. In fact, if I try to run this, you can see React complains, and I guess in this case it says unknown error. Sometimes it will say that you have to wrap the elements that you're trying to render in some kind of parent element. Now, this doesn't mean that I can't put two elements on my page at any given time. It just means that I need to wrap them in something like a div, for example. So if I say a div that has an h1 and a paragraph inside, now I am rendering just one parent element, and it doesn't really matter how many children elements are included, as long as I have one parent element that I'm rendering. So I can hit save. We'll see that this is working just fine. Now, remember how I was able to save my h1 as a variable? Well, I can actually save a whole collection of JSX, for example, this div with the h1 and the paragraph, as a variable. So let's say const page equals, and then I can paste in my elements here. Now, to me, this looks a little bit crazy. So normally what I like to do is move my elements, my JSX, onto their own lines as if this were HTML. But in that case, I need to go ahead and wrap everything in parentheses. Now, take a second and think, how is it that I can then fix what I have down here? We can see we have a syntax error. How can I fix this so that when I refresh the page, this is still working? Pause here and see if you can figure out how to make this work again. Well, all of my JSX is being saved under the variable of page, so I should just be able to put page here and hit refresh, and sure enough, that's working just fine. Hopefully some of you were kind of curious to see what this looks like as a JavaScript object. If we console log page, we can see that essentially we got what we had last time, but this time it's a little more involved. Specifically, in the children property of our div, we see that there's other React elements in there. I'm not going to dive too deep into that. Feel free to copy and paste what you see in the console, maybe clean it up a little bit and analyze it. But the point is, I can save a whole bunch of JSX into a single variable and then use that variable kind of like any other variable. And the key is, that's because what I'm getting back when I write my JSX is just a JavaScript object. Okay, I'm going to clean this page up a little bit. And I'm going to comment out our page because I'm going to give you a challenge. Okay, I left our example of const page up here just for reference, but I did delete our code that we had at the bottom, which actually enabled us to put something on the screen. And that's because I want you to practice it again. So your challenge is to create a navigation bar using JSX. I've given you some instructions here on what the content should actually be. And as I mentioned at the very end, don't worry about styling yet. We're going to cover styling soon, but for now, what you're going to have is just going to look like plain HTML that's unstyled. So pause the screencast here and see if you can complete this challenge. Okay, before I worry about the React DOM.render bit, I'm going to create a new variable. We'll call it actually, let's call it navbar. And I'm going to use my parentheses so that I can start my element on the next line. And like I mentioned, we want to use the semantic nav element. And inside of there, I'm going to have an h1. Let's call it Bob's Bistro. Maybe this is a restaurant. Okay. And then we have an unordered list. And hopefully while you were playing with this, you came to realize that it doesn't matter how nested I get. Just like in HTML, I can nest this as deep as I want. We'll create 3 list items. And it said pricing, about, and contact. And I don't know, maybe if this is a restaurant, I'll say menu instead of pricing. Okay, I've got my JSX for my navbar set up. And then the last bit, which was just meant to be something repetitive that allows you to get some muscle memory for this, is to use React DOM.render. And the first parameter is what do I want to render, and that's my navbar JSX. And the second thing is where do I want to render it. I'm going to do that by selecting with getElementById my div with the ID of root that is over in my index.html right there. Okay, I should hit save, and sure enough, it's pretty ugly. Obviously, we want to style this. We're going to get to that soon. I hope that challenge went well for you. If you struggled, please don't keep pushing forward. Go back, rewatch this lesson, see if you can do this again from scratch, or maybe just try typing it 10 or 15 times if you need to. Also, if you get totally stuck, don't forget that this is a community. You can reach out on Discord, ask your question, and you are more than likely to get a really friendly, helpful response back. When you're feeling pretty good about this, let's keep moving forward. Okay, at this point, it's probably time for us to switch away from the easy way of getting React set up in our project to the more correct way. Now, inside of Scrimba, that means something different than it means inside of your own local environment. Scrimba has kind of some magic that's happening under the hood that's helping React just kind of work in our project. So I'm going to show you a couple steps for how I do this in Scrimba. You won't really have to worry too much about that because even when you're creating your own new scrim in Scrimba, it'll just ask you what type of scrim you want, and you'll just tell it that it's a React scrim and it'll set everything up for you. So what I need to do is in my index.html, I'm actually going to remove all of my unpackage.com CDNs here. So I can get rid of these 3 lines. And I don't need this type text Babel anymore because I'm not pulling in Babel. And instead, over here on the left, I'm going to add the dependencies that I need. And I need React, and I need React-DOM. If you're a little bit more familiar with developing in JavaScript, you might recognize that these dependencies are similar to having a package.json where you install these packages through npm. If pretty much everything I just said doesn't make sense, don't worry about it at all. I am going to talk about different options for local setup later. If you absolutely need to follow along in your local environment instead of here on Scrimba.com, you can continue to use the CDN way that we were just using like this. But otherwise, I just recommend doing things here inside of Scrimba. Our main focus is not going to be how to set up React, but rather how to write React. So I will take those back out. And now that I have taken those CDNs out, it means that I no longer have global variables added to my window like React DOM. So if I try to save this, we're going to see I have an unexpected token angle bracket. And that's because, well, it doesn't know what React is at all. What I need to do now is actually import React from React. This might not seem like it's doing anything because I'm actually not referencing React anywhere here. I've got React DOM, but that's something different. However, React is where the JSX syntax is defined, and so I need to import React in order for this to work at all. Now, the astute among you might be familiar with the fact that with React version 17, I technically don't need to import React. However, currently at the time of this recording, Scrimba is not yet set up to support the fact that React version 17 and above no longer requires you to import React in order for JSX to work. So anyway, throughout the duration of this course, I will be using import React from React, and that's because, well, I need to in this environment currently. Let's hit save again and see what we run into next. And this says cannot use import statement outside of a module. And oh, you know what? I think that has to do with another sort of magic piece that is happening under the hood with Scrimba. So I'm going to add this .pack. That's not something you'll need to do in the real world. So this should be, yep, React DOM is not defined. That's the error I expected to see. And that's because whenever we're using React DOM, I will also need to import React DOM from React-DOM. And now, fingers crossed, I should get something that works again. Okay, there we go. We're back on the screen, and everything is set up a little more similar to how you normally would see a React project set up. Don't be overly concerned with all of these implementation details. However, this is how I'm going to be setting up my projects from here on. And at this point, we actually have enough knowledge for us to start working on this section's project, which is a static HTML page in React. However, before we jump into that, I want to exercise your brain with a little thought experiment, and we are going to do that in the next screencast. I'd like to do a quick thought experiment with you, and that is to figure out why we're using React DOM.render instead of just using the DOM append method that you've probably used before in JavaScript. I've written the first line for you, and that's to import React from React. That will just allow you to write some JSX. Your challenge, as you can see in this little 4-step process here, is to create just a really simple sample page in JSX. It has to be greater than or equal to 4 elements, just to get your fingers working a little bit. And I want you to save that JSX to a variable. Remember that that variable needs to be one parent element with some children elements nested inside of it. In other words, we can't just have 2 sibling elements saved in a variable in JSX. Then I want you to select the div with the ID of root using whatever selector you want to use, and then use .append to append your JSX. If you need to do a quick Google search for how to use .append, that's totally fine. And then before you run your code, I want you to see if you can guess what's going to show up in the browser before you run the code, and then run your code and see if you can explain what does show up in the browser. Pause here and play around with this a bit. Okay, well, let's create our JSX. We'll say const page equals, and I'll open my parentheses so I can write my JSX on its own line. And we'll start with a div just to surround everything. And I don't know, let's say I'm making a page about why I love React. We'll say this is my awesome website in React. And then maybe an H3 that says, here are the reasons I love React. And we'll use an ordered list. It's not terribly important what you actually put in here. I'll just use some of the reasons that I've been talking about. It's composable. It's declarative. It's a very hireable skill to have. Let's see, I need to get rid of this. And it's very actively maintained by some very skilled people. Again, the JSX you chose to put in here is not terribly important. So we'll use document.getElementById root and then use the DOM nodes append method to append our page, and we'll see what shows up here. Now, of course, I know what's going to show up, so I'm just going to run the code, and we see that we get object object. This object object is sort of a string representation of a regular JavaScript object. Something I can do to actually make that object appear is to stringify it using JSON. So I can actually say json.stringify, and we will stringify that object so that it puts JSON on the page. I'll hit save, and look at that. We get a JavaScript object. Now, step 4, see if you can explain why this actually shows up in the browser. Well, kind of the whole purpose of this thought experiment was to remind you that JSX returns plain JavaScript objects. At this point in time, it has nothing to do with the DOM. It's not recognized by the browser as anything important dealing with the DOM. It's only when we try to render it using React DOM.render that React can take these JavaScript objects and actually turn them into real DOM elements that the browser can interpret as things like first level headers or ordered lists. So let's go ahead for the sake of practice and fix this. I'm going to update our challenge here. Okay, simply put, your challenge is to fix our code. And don't forget, we're not using those CDNs in our HTML anymore, which is what used to give us a global variable called React DOM. So you'll have to see if you can remember how we get access to React DOM. Pause the screencast here and try to fix our code. In order to use React DOM, I will need to import it, and we'll import it from the React DOM package. Then instead of selecting my div with the ID of root, actually I'm going to need that anyway, so I will leave that code there. I'll say React DOM.render. The thing I want to render is my page, so we'll put page, and the where I want to render it is inside of that div with the ID of root. I'm going to comment this out so it doesn't break it. We'll hit save, and there we go. Awesome. So simply put, React DOM's job, or the React DOM.render method's job, is to take React elements and interpret them in a way that turns them into real DOM elements that the browser can understand. Okay, with that understanding, it's only a small jump to work on our section project, which is to build a static page in React. We're going to start the first steps of that in the next screencast. Okay, we're finally at our first challenge. I'm really excited to start working on this. I've included a Google slide of what you're aiming for with this challenge. Notice there's really no styling being applied here at all. It's just bare HTML. So if we go look at the challenge, essentially you are starting completely from scratch, and your job is to build the HTML for our section project as you see it here. We'll be adding just a little bit of styling to it later after we learn how to do that. And I've included a couple hints here. For simplicity, I've imported the React logo file directly into our file explorer here, which means that you can reference it in your image element that you create with source equals and then using a /react-logo.png. I also have a hint here about how to set the width attribute. Just remember that JSX is almost identical to HTML. And in fact, for what you're working on here, you really shouldn't see any difference between the JSX that you'll write and what you would normally write in HTML. Don't forget that we are no longer using our CDNs, so you'll have to remember how to bring in React, React DOM, and so forth. That's all the hints I'm going to give you, so pause the screencast here and work on this challenge. Well, first things first, let's import React from React and import React DOM from React-DOM. We can't really do anything until we've done that. Then I'm going to save a variable called page. And as a heads up, this isn't actually going to be a very common way for us to deal with JSX. We're going to see very soon how we can do this in a more conventional way. For the sake of learning, though, I think this is a good way for us to start. Just to do a bit of a sanity check, I'm going to just throw an H1 in here. It says testing, and then do my last step, which is React DOM.render. And we want to render our page. And we want to put it at the div with the ID of root. Let's see if that's working. Okay, cool. We have testing showing up. That means that everything else is set up correctly. Okay, so let's start building our page here. I'm going to surround everything in a div just because I can only have one element here, rather one parent element here instead of any sibling elements. And the first thing I'll put in is an image. And just like in HTML, I can provide an image source. And like I mentioned up in the hints, I'm going to have react-logo.png. The / just means look in the same folder for a file called react-logo.png. Now, if I refresh this, I'm going to get a pretty large image here. So just like in HTML, I can set the width to be something specific like 40 pixels. And that looks a little more manageable, a little less crazy, not taking up my whole screen. Next, I've got something that looks kind of like an H1 that says fun facts about React. So we will add that in there. And awesome. Now, because my H1 is a block element, it has floated below my image, even though my image is technically an inline element. And that's kind of to be expected, or rather that's what we're aiming for. And then it looks like the last thing is an unordered list with these 5 list items. So I'll go ahead and add that unordered list. We'll do some list items. I'm going to hold Shift Option down to copy these lines, and then just start typing in some of these facts. Okay, and yeah, these are some pretty interesting facts about React. I'll hit save. And awesome. It looks like we essentially got to where we wanted to get to with our goal here. I'll go ahead and clean up some of my comments up here from the challenge. And great work. Hopefully you were able to follow along with that. Now, like I mentioned, saving all of our JSX to a single variable like this actually isn't really that common, nor is it convenient at all. So what we're going to start covering is a much more common way, and that is by creating custom components. Before we jump into that, I want to give you a quick quiz over the topics that we've talked about so far, and we will do that in the next screencast. Before jumping right into the next topic, I thought it would be smart to have a quick little pop quiz on some of the topics that we've covered up to this point. Because this is Scrimba, you can just click into this quiz.md file and answer the questions here. So pause the screencast and work on this quiz. Why do we need to import React from React in our files? Well, it's because the JSX syntax is defined in React. And if we were to remove React, we would see that it's telling us React is not defined. Even though we're not using React in our code, the JSX here sort of demands that React be a part of our code base. So I will go type that over here. React is what defines JSX. So in order to use JSX, we need to import React. If I were to console log the page in our index.js file, what would show up? Hopefully you actually attempted to answer this question before just going ahead and console logging it. Before I hit save, I know that page is a bunch of JSX, which in reality just returns some JavaScript objects. So when I console log page, I should just see a JavaScript object here. And sure enough, there it is. If you look closely at that object, you'll see a children property, and that children property has more React elements nested inside. Well, that's because we have our React element here with children that are more React elements. So over here, we can say a JavaScript object. These are React elements that describe what React should eventually add to the real DOM for us. Okay, number 3, what is wrong with this code? Hopefully you noticed that our JSX here is 2 sibling elements, and remembered that we actually need all of our JSX to be nested under a single parent element. As a quick sneak peek, in the future you may learn that you can use something that looks like an empty tag like this in order to wrap your JSX in something that doesn't actually create another parent element. These are called fragments, but that's more a little piece of trivia. We're not going to concern ourselves too much with that in this course. Next is number 4. What does it mean for something to be declarative instead of imperative? The way we described it before was to say that declarative programming meant I could tell the program what to accomplish and it would know how to accomplish the specific step-by-step details, whereas imperative meant I still needed to tell the computer step-by-step how to do everything. An example I like to think of this is to imagine myself asking a friend to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for me. If I were doing that declaratively, I could simply say, could you make me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? And I would assume that they knew how to take care of the individual steps to do so. If I were being imperative, on the other hand, I would have to tell them to grab a slice of bread with their fingers and place that slice of bread gently on a plate, then to grab a knife from the drawer and to put the knife into a jar of peanut butter, and so forth. There certainly are times when something imperative is warranted. However, generally speaking, writing code declaratively is a much better developer experience and honestly usually leads to fewer bugs in the end. So declarative means I can tell the computer what to do and expect it to handle the details. Imperative means I need to tell it how to do each step. And lastly, what does it mean for something to be composable? Well, that just means that I can create small pieces that I put together to make a greater whole. In terms of web development, it means I can take pieces of my UI, my user interface, and put them into their own components, and then piece those components together to build my page. So what does it mean for something to be composable? It means that we have small pieces that we can put together to make something larger, and I'll even say greater than the individual pieces. This is a pretty broad definition of composable because the idea and concept of composability extends throughout all of computer programming, not just web development, and especially not just React. But I think we've gotten the point across. I'm really excited to keep moving forward. We are now going to jump into sort of the baseline level of React and start learning how to create our own components, and it's just going to get more and more exciting from there. So strap yourselves in and let's keep moving forward. When we talked about composability being one of the major benefits of React, we talked about the possibility in React to create our own custom components. What we currently have going on is we're saving our JSX elements here, our React elements, in a variable, and then rendering that variable directly with React DOM.render. And although this has been working for us so far, it doesn't allow us a lot of flexibility when it comes to creating our own components in React. And even further, it's also pretty obvious we wouldn't want to take all of our markup and stuff it directly into React DOM.render, even though I think technically this might work just fine. Actually, I'm curious. Let's give this a shot. I'll comment this out. Okay, so everything is technically still working, but we run into the same issue as we used to in kind of the old days of creating HTML code, where if we're trying to stuff everything into one place, not only do the elements not become reusable, but it becomes really difficult to maintain as a developer. So creating our variable up here got us one step closer, but it's still not quite good enough. Instead, what we are going to start learning about is creating our own custom components. Now, I gave you a taste of this early on in the course, but we're going to actually learn it the real way now. In programming, the concept of a function is one that allows us to write some code that we can then execute over and over and over again just by calling that function. And React adopts this same concept of having a function that allows us to create user interface or create elements over and over and over again if we wanted to. Knowing how functions work, it's really tempting to say, okay, well, I'm going to create a function and let's give it a temporary name for just a second. And we might say, well, I have a function and I want it to return my UI, my elements here, anytime that function gets called. So I might try something like this. Let me get rid of page here, and then instead of page, we might say, well, let's call our temporary name function, and that is going to return the React elements that we asked it to, and therefore we have a function that we can reuse. Well, let's see what happens. Look at that. It actually worked. And what we have here is basically 90% of the way into creating our own custom components. A function like this that returns React elements is considered in React a component. However, there's a couple of conventions that we need to follow for everything to work correctly all the time. The first one is we need to use Pascal case instead of camel case for our component names. All that means is I need to capitalize the first letter of my component. And secondly, instead of calling this function with parentheses like we might be used to, we actually need to wrap it in angle brackets similar to an HTML element. And I still need to change this to a capital letter there. And that's the only changes we need to make from a regular JavaScript function that you have probably written hundreds of by now, and a React component that uses the same concept of functions to create reusable user interface pieces. You'll see if I hit save, everything is still working as we would expect. Okay, maybe you can feel it. It's time for a practice. I'm actually going to erase everything because you are going to write everything again from scratch. First, I'll write out the challenge for you. Okay, I've erased our code and saved it so that our page went away. This challenge is going to be given to you in two parts. The first part is to create an ordered list that enumerates the reasons why you're excited to be learning React. Don't spend too much time trying to come up with a huge list. Just put a few things in an ordered list. And then I want you to render your list to the page. This is going to require you to remember all of the steps that we've learned so far on the basics of setting up a React app. So pause the screencast and work on part 1 of this challenge. To get started, we need to import React from React. I need to spell React correctly there. And we'll import React DOM from React-DOM. We'll go ahead and use React DOM to render. Let's start with just some inline JSX here. We'll say it's working. And I need to select my root element as the place to put this H1. Hit save as a sanity check, and we know it's working. Awesome. Now the meat. We are going to create our own custom page component by using a function called page, using a capital letter to begin. And this function is simply going to return some UI, or in other words, some JSX that we can put in the page. Just as another little sanity check, I'm just going to remove the H1 here and put it inside my page component, and then render my page component as we've learned. And I refresh and everything is still working, and just to make sure, I'll just make a change. I'll say it's still working. Okay, so now the next part. We are going to turn this into an ordered list, and we'll just put a few list items in here. And let's see, these are reasons that we're excited to be learning React. Maybe for one, it's a popular library, so I'll be able to fit in with the cool kids. This probably has a pretty loose definition for what the cool kids are, but that's okay. Okay, we'll put a second item here. And just so you can see everything, I'm going to move this onto its own line there. We'll say I'm more likely to get a job as a developer if I know React. And hopefully you have some other good reasons. I'm going to leave it at that for now, just for the sake of learning. I'll go ahead and refresh, and there we go. We've got our two pretty ugly, unstyled elements that we have on the page, but it seems to be working. Okay, nice work on part 1 of the challenge. In part 2 of the challenge, which will be in the next screencast, we're going to add a little bit more to our simple page here. However, before moving on, if any part of this was still confusing for you, I really encourage you to go back, try to rewatch some of these videos. You could even start from the beginning. Maybe you'll have some additional context that will help in your understanding. And as always, reach out to the Scrimba community on Discord. If you have any questions, people are always happy to answer. But don't just plow forward if you're still feeling confused. Do some research, rewatch some of the videos, make sure you're doing all of the challenges, and then when you're ready, let's go forward and we'll work on part 2. The next part of our challenge is to add some more elements to our page here. First, I want you to add a header element with a nested nav element inside, and then inside the nav, you'll have a nested image element with the source that I've mentioned here, and some other notes that you should read through. I also want you to add an H1 element that will go below the header element, but above the ordered list. And at the very bottom, underneath the ordered list, I want you to add a footer element with some text that I have here. Make sure to read through the whole challenge there so you get a better idea of what you need to be working on. And as always, pause the screencast here and work on this challenge. One of the biggest tricks in this challenge is to make sure that you don't just try to add a header. Hopefully that didn't cause too many headaches for anyone, but the biggest problem with this is that, again, I'm trying to create two sibling JSX elements here, one with the header and one with the ordered list. Inside of a component, I just can't do that. I have to have one parent component. So I could either use those fragment tags that I briefly mentioned earlier, like this, or a lot of times you'll see people just wrap it in a div like this. Now that I've done that, everything is working again the way I'd expect. Inside of my header, I'm going to include a nav element. Nav is just basically an HTML5 semantic element that is basically the same thing as a div, except it's better for screen readers and assistive technologies. Inside of my nav, I'm going to have an image element, and that one needs to have a source that I included up here. So I'll just copy this and make sure I get that quotation mark there. Get rid of that extra space. And let's just save this and see how things are looking. Okay, and my React logo is huge, so I'm going to give it a width of 40 pixels like I've done before. Okay, that's more manageable. Next, we need to add an H1 with some text describing the page, like reasons why I'm excited to learn React. We'll just copy that. Let's see, that'll go underneath the header, and we'll put an H1 there, and I'll just paste that text in right there. Refresh it, and okay, that's starting to look good. Then at the very bottom, so this is above this ending div, because I still need it to be a part of my page component, but below my ordered list, I'm going to add a footer element. And inside the footer, we need to have this text here, but we'll customize it to be relevant for me. So currently it's 2021. This has got semantic problems because I have those elements there. And I'm going to call this Zroll Development because Zroll's my last name. All rights reserved. Real official. This is not going to be stolen by anyone for sure now that I have this footer here. And let's go ahead and refresh this. Sometimes people will put this inside of a small tag. I'm kind of just curious to see what that looks like. I need to end this correctly. And yeah, I guess that looks a little better. We'll leave it like that. Okay, nice work. Now, some of you may have been wondering, well, why am I just building everything as this monolithic page component? I thought the whole reason that we were creating our own custom components is because then I can compose them together instead of just shoving everything into this one component. And you would be right. So in the next lesson, we are going to learn how to compose these elements together, learning the concept of parent and child components and so forth. Before we do that, though, I want to make sure that you've been awake and that you're following along. We're going to have a quick quiz. So that is coming up next. Okay, it's quiz time again. Read through the questions in the quiz, actually click into the editor, type down your answers. And if you find yourself not knowing the answer to one of these, don't just kind of plow ahead, but instead actually do some research. See if you can figure out on your own with Google and whatever other resources you have available to you what the answer to the quiz question is before just moving on. So pause now, answer the questions to the quiz, and then we'll go through them together. All right, number one, what is a React component? Well, basically put, a React component is simply a function that returns React elements. Well, what exactly are React elements? React elements are the objects that get created when we return JSX. So although this looks very much like HTML, remember this is JSX, which is a special syntax of React, and under the hood, it's returning a regular JavaScript object. Those objects are eventually turned into real DOM elements that people can see on the screen. So sometimes you'll hear people refer to this as UI or user interface. And that just means that it's what the user can actually see on the screen. And just like any other JavaScript function, a component can be reused over and over. Here I'm creating a page component, but I can run my page function, so to speak, or in other words, create an instance of my page component by just rendering page again. Okay, let's go to number two. What is wrong with the following code? It's a really small difference, but it's an important one. Any components that you create need to begin with a capital letter. This is called Pascal case, where it's essentially camel case, but where the first letter is also capitalized. Basically, anytime you might want to have, I guess you could say, different words in your component name, like my component, all you do is capitalize the first letter of the next word. This would, of course, be instead of putting some kind of space in between there, like in a regular sentence. And then finally, what's wrong with the code in number three? Hopefully this one wasn't too difficult to find, but if you look way down here, instead of calling our function like you might normally be used to by adding parentheses at the end, with function components in React, you instead surround these with the angle brackets as if it were a regular HTML tag. And in React, this is the correct way to, I guess you could say, call your component or create an instance of your component. Okay, short and sweet. Nice job on that quiz. Hopefully you were able to follow along. Next, we're going to move forward and see how we can do a better job of composing our components together. As we've mentioned, it's not ideal to be taking our entire markup and stuffing it into one component like we're doing here. So let's learn through practice the concept of creating a parent and child component. We're going to start this off by having you do a mini challenge. So let me type out that challenge here. Okay, your little mini challenge is to take the header element from our page and to put it into its own component that's called header. Technically speaking, I'm not necessarily asking you to then render the header inside the page, but if you want a little extra credit challenge, you can render that header component that you just made inside of the page here. Pause now and work on this mini challenge. Okay, just like it says, we are going to create a separate header component here. And we're doing this outside of page because they're different components. And basically, I can just cut out this whole header section and return it from my header component. And that's really all the mini challenge was asking you to do. Now, if you didn't try to do the little extra credit I gave you and render the header inside here, I want you to think for a second, what might that look like? Well, just like we are creating our page component down here, or rather we're creating an instance of our page component down here, I can create an instance of my header component by just typing it out like this, as if it were an HTML element amongst my other code. And here we see the concept of composability in practice. I've set aside some of my UI to be managed by a single header component, and then anytime I want to essentially insert these elements into my page, I can create an instance of my header component just like this. Now, in a web page that's this small, it's really not that necessary to do this, but I'm sure you can imagine if this were a much larger application, especially one that had pieces that had a lot of user interaction and so forth, it becomes really, really beneficial to move these things into their own separate components. Okay, so that leads us to the next part of this challenge, which I will type out now. Essentially, I want you to do the same thing, but now with the footer as its own component and the rest of the content as its own component. Pause now and work on this challenge. Okay, just like before, we'll create a new footer function or component here, and it's going to return the footer content. I'll just cut that out of there, put it right here, and down here in its place, we will render the footer component. Okay, and then we'll do the same thing for the main content component. I'll take everything here, including the H1. And there's a little trick here because if you tried to just paste that in, you'll notice that this is two sibling elements, which again, we can't just render side by side. We need a parent element to surround them. So I will put this div down there, indent there, and we will render an instance of our main content component. Now, I should be able to refresh the page and essentially have the exact same thing. Of course, now that I've wrapped this in a div, very technically speaking, these elements are now children of the div, and the div exists right here on this level. For my purposes now, this div is not harming anything, it's not changing my styling or anything, so I'm not terribly worried about it. So hopefully you can understand now the idea or the naming of parent-child components. We have a parent component, which is our page component, and just by virtue of it rendering other components, these other components become, by name, children components. And just like HTML, this can go deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. I could have main content rendering another component that we have also made. And then relative to main content, that other component would be a child component, and main content would be the parent component. This really is no different than in our HTML, how you can have different levels of parent, child, and even grandchild, or whatever you want to call it. Nice work on this challenge. You can see that we are now composing our page together of other components. Now, we're pretty overdue in learning the ability to add some styling to our page, so that's what we're going to work on next.
We're going to start off this lesson with a sort of mini challenge. Our goal is to add a navigation bar to our little site here. And navigation items like this are usually handled with something like an unordered list with list items. So that's your challenge. Underneath our image here, your challenge is to add an unordered list with 3 list items for pricing, about, and contact. In the end, this will essentially be like adding some HTML to your page, so this should be pretty quick. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Simply enough, we can add an unordered list with our 3 list items for pricing,
about, and contact. Let's hit save and see where we are. Okay, pretty ugly, but we're going to style this now. Fortunately, styling something in React is as simple as adding classes, just like you would in regular HTML. The only difference you need to know about is that instead of using class equals, we're going to use class name equals. And that's because under the hood, if you remember, React is taking these JSX elements and turning them into native DOM elements. And just like when we were creating things in vanilla JavaScript, we would say something like const unordered list equals document.createElement with unordered list as the type. And then we would say ul.className equals something if we wanted to set the class name. So in the end, that's why we're using class name instead of class in React. And so I will set the class name here to maybe nav-items. Hit save, and then in our style.css, I can add nav items. And maybe first let's take the list style off. So we'll say list style of none, and sure enough, our bullets go away. And that brings us to the next part of this challenge. Using Flexbox, I want you to line up the nav items horizontally so that they sit next to each other like this. And then also using Flexbox, I want you to line up the unordered list with your newly horizontal list items to be in line with our logo so that everything is nice and aligned just like we have in this image. In doing so, I want you only to use CSS classes. I don't want you to select any bare elements like the whole nav or anything like that, mostly just so we can get some practice typing out class name. Pause the screencast and work on this part of the challenge. Well, let's piggyback off our nav items class, which we already have. I should just be able to change the display to flex, and sure enough, that gives me all of my items in a row. Now let's put our list item in line with our logo image here, and then we'll worry about some spacing between these items. Back in my code, I'm going to probably give my nav a class name of nav. Of course, I could have just selected the whole nav element, but like I mentioned, we're here to practice class names. So I'll make a class name of nav, and we'll select our nav. Let me hit refresh over here so that the styles will apply immediately. And I'll give this a display of flex. Awesome. Our elements are in a line. Now, because my nav only has two elements, the image as the first element and the unordered list as the second element, I guess I should say two direct children, I can just use justify content space between to push that pricing about and contact items to the far right. It also looks like our logo got a bit stretched. That just kind of happens in Flex containers. So I'll say align items center, and that should fix my aspect ratios of the image. And then I'll go ahead and add a little bit of space between my list items there. I know I mentioned using classes, but in the case of list items, I usually prefer to select the unordered list by its class, and then just select all the list items. That way I don't have to go in and add a class name to every single one of my list items. Let's just give those a padding of maybe 10 pixels. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now, my image is looking a little bit small to me. I want to make it bigger, but oh yeah, we added this width attribute. But now that we know how to style with classes, let's have sort of an impromptu third part of this challenge. Okay, your task is to change the image styling to happen in the CSS instead of right here in line. And of course, for practice, let's add a new class to the image just so you can style it that way. Pause the screencast and work on this part of the challenge. Simply enough, we can take our width out, which is going to make our image pretty huge if I refresh, but we'll give it a class name. Let's call it nav-logo. And then we will select our nav logo, and let's give it our width of 40 pixels again. I have to hit refresh over here. Okay, we're back where we were. Actually, this logo is looking a little small. Let me try 60 pixels. Yeah, I think I like that size better. At this point, I think it's a perfect opportunity for you to continue practicing styling this page. Obviously, this page is really small in its scope. And so before we just push forward, I would like you to spend at least a few minutes styling up this page, making it look a little bit nicer, add your own flair to it. In fact, I actually did that and put maybe 5 minutes of styling into it, which obviously shows it's not going to win any design awards. But I did change the font to use a Google font. I added this little box shadow under our nav bar. I moved the footer down to the actual footer section of our page, the bottom of our page, and added some really basic styles to it. So this is a great opportunity not only for you to flex your CSS skills and get your hands on the keyboard and do some practice, but also to interact with the Scrimba community, especially on Discord. Once you've styled something up that looks, well, pretty much anything's going to look better than this, once you have some kind of style added, take a screenshot and share it in Discord. As you make changes to your code here in Scrimba, it will create a note that you can save, and you can even share that on Twitter. You can share the link to that in Discord, whatever it takes for you to get involved with the Scrimba community. Once you've had a chance to apply some of your own creativity to this little page, the next thing we're going to do is clean up our code here, where right now we have everything kind of stuffed into our index.js file, and we're going to learn how we can move these components into their own folders and clean up our code a bit. There are practically innumerable ways to organize your projects, and so I'm hoping to, in this screencast, just teach you some of the principles, and as we go through the course, you may see different methods that I use. And of course, as you look at other people's code, you'll see the ways that they use as well for organizing their code. Now, what we have here is a very small site for React. There's hardly anything here. I barely have 50 lines of code to make this page. However, anything substantial that you have will end up being hundreds, more likely thousands, or even tens of thousands of lines of code in total. So it's really important to have an organization system that makes sense to you, to your group, and something that you agree upon in the beginning and stick to as you continue to develop. So I'm going to show you with separating one of these components into its own file, and then I'm going to give you a challenge to do the same for the others. So what I'll do is work on the header, and we're going to move header into its own file. So I'm going to create a new file in my Explorer up here called header.js. A convention that I personally like to stick to is that any file I create that will essentially house a React component will start with a capital letter the same as the component's name itself. Now I'm going to copy, or actually cut, this entire component out, and over in header.js I'm going to paste it. Now there's a couple things I need to change here. I want you to pause the screencast and see if you can think of two things that I need to change in this file in order for me to then be able to import it into this file so that it's working the way that it was before. So take a good look at this, pause the screencast, see if you can figure that out. Well, remember, in order for the program to make any sense of JSX, I always need to import React from React. Even though we're not explicitly using capital REACT anywhere here in my code, for JSX to work, I will need to import React from React. Again, this is something that has recently changed. If you're working in an environment that is actively using the updated React 17, then you may not have to do this. The other thing is currently this component is completely stuck inside of this file. I'm not sending it outside of this file anywhere. And so I need to export it. And oftentimes, if this is the only component that I'll have, I choose to export default the component. So I'll say export default header. Alternatively, I could save myself a little bit of lines of code here and just put export default function header right up at the top, and then I don't have to create a separate line down here that does it separately. Personally, I kind of oscillate between these two, so you can just choose whichever one you think you prefer the most and stick with that convention. If you're feeling a little bit rusty on export, import, export default, and so forth, you may want to spend some time researching import and export in ES6, because we will be using it quite a bit in this React course. Now that I have exported my header component, it means that over in my index.js, I can import it, and I'll say import header from, and then I have to use ./H header. And I could say .js, but that's the default extension for imports, so I don't need to specify .js. In this case, ./ is a way to indicate that I'm talking about a file in my own project here, not a package that's in my dependencies like React and React DOM. And I have to make sure that I spell this the exact same as my file name, not necessarily the name of the component. I could have chosen to call this head like that, and I still would have to say import header from ./header. Or in this case, I could say import whatever because I'm doing an export default. If that's confusing, don't worry too much about it. I prefer to keep the names all the same so that I don't run into any confusion there. Okay, we'll put an extra line here. What's nice about this is now my code is sort of sequestered into the header.js file, which means that if I want to change the header, I can logically come to my header.js file to make changes to my header. And I don't need to change how it's rendered down here because when I import it, I'm importing everything that I have in my header.js file, just like it was when it was declared here in the index.js file. Okay, let's get some practice. Let me type out your challenge. Simple enough. Just move the footer component and the main content component into their own files. And then, of course, do what you need to do to make it so that our site doesn't break down. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Okay, let's do this. I'm just going to cut my footer out, create a new file called F_footer.js, paste my code in, and we'll import React from React so that our JSX works. And then I'll export default my footer function, my footer component, and make sure that I import it here. Say import footer from footer. And just by importing it, now my footer should just be working the same way as it was. I'll hit refresh and everything is working. Awesome. We'll do the same thing for main content. And I can clean up some of these extra lines. Create a new component or file called main content.js. Paste it in. Export default. Import React from React. And of course, we haven't yet imported it, so we will import it. Main content. Hit save, and we're back up and running. Can remove this challenge, and all of a sudden, we're down to 17 lines of code. We're importing these components from other files, and that way we have a much better organization on our app here. Again, like I said, there's a million different ways to organize your code. It's also not uncommon for people to even take this component that's sort of organizing our other components and put it in its own file. A lot of times, instead of calling it page, they'll call it app. That's actually the convention I tend to use. So maybe I'll go ahead and just change this to app while I'm at it. But because of the limited size of this project, I'm not terribly concerned about moving this component into its own file and then also importing all of those other components into that separate file. It just feels like maybe over-engineering it for such a small project. Okay, awesome work. Hopefully this has been helpful. We're going to be using organization like this throughout the rest of this course. So again, if you're feeling confused about how we're exporting things or importing them, then you may want to spend some time researching export and import in ES6 just to become a little more familiar with it. Or another great way to do that would be to just play with this code. See if you can delete these lines, delete the export default line, and just try to recreate it. See if you can get it to work again. When you feel comfortable with everything we've covered so far, let's keep moving forward. Earlier in the course, we saw sort of the quick and easy way to get a local version of React up and running using some CDN links and an in-browser Babel transpiler to get everything working. You see, since React uses a syntax that isn't normally understood by the browser, there needs to be some kind of tool to translate this weird-looking JavaScript, like JSX, into something that the browser can actually make sense of, like regular old JavaScript. However, that in-browser Babel transpiler that we were using is not really a good long-term solution, which is why we saw that warning that says, well, basically you should do this in a different way if you're going to be pushing it up to production. So instead, what you normally need to do is set up a whole bundler system using something like Webpack. I've linked to the Webpack homepage if you want to go visit it there. and you would teach your Webpack configuration how to use Babel, the transpiler or compiler, so that essentially it would take your React code and transpile it or compile it down to something that is readable by browsers with regular JavaScript. Just to be totally clear, Babel and Webpack are not specific to React, but in order for React to work on most web browsers, you would normally have to use Babel and Webpack to translate it into something that a browser would make sense of. And the truth is, unless you've already dealt with Webpack a bunch before, it's honestly a bit of a high bar for beginners to clear when they're just learning web development. So to help significantly reduce that overhead in getting started with React, the React team created a package called Create React App, which does all of the heavy lifting for you, and it even hides a bunch of that implementation detail of Webpack from you in the code. So in the end, it really just makes setting up a new React app on your local machine really simple. So let's take a look at the process of using Create React App to create a new React app on your local machine. Before you can jump into Create React App, you have to make sure that you have Node.js and NPM installed on your machine. To see if you have these installed, you can open up your terminal and type node -v. That's a flag to check the version of Node. If it spits out any number, that means that you do have Node installed. And if you do have Node installed, then you also more than likely have NPM installed as well. But for good measure, you might as well run npm -v. And again, if it displays a version number, that means you do have NPM installed. Now, the next few slides are going to give a very high-level overview of how to install Node and NPM. So if you already have Node and NPM, you can sort of tune out the next couple minutes or skip ahead. And honestly, there's a lot of help already out there on how to install Node.js. I would just recommend going to YouTube and searching install Node.js, but specifically install Node.js with something called NVM. So I would recommend using NVM, which is the Node version manager. Its purpose is just to make switching and installing different Node versions extraordinarily easy. But it does mean that you have to install another package. If you're on a Mac or Linux machine, you can use NVM. I've included a link to their GitHub repository here. Or if you're on Windows, you can click here to go to a package called nvm-windows. But again, I would just default to following some kind of install Node.js with NVM tutorial that you find on YouTube. Okay, so now you have NVM installed. The next step is to open your terminal again, and this time type nvm install --LTS. Now, this command is specific to the NVM for the Mac or Linux. I think it might be slightly different for NVM-Windows. I think that might just be NVM install LTS with no --, but you'll have to check the documentation and follow the instructions in that YouTube video to be sure. Then once that finishes installing, we come full circle, and you should be able to double check your Node version and your NPM version the same way we saw before. And again, by the time you're watching this, it very well may not be these versions. It might be a newer version than this. Now with Node and NPM installed, we're ready to actually use Create React App. On the Create React App website, you can see this Getting Started section. The main thing we care about are these commands down here. Just to make things even more confusing, there's another thing called npx. We won't really get into what npx is, but for now, it's enough to know that you can just type this top command, npx create react app, space, and then the name of whatever you want the folder that holds your app to be. After typing that first line, you can hit return, and you'll see an output in your terminal that's more or less similar to this. You can see at the very bottom, it says we suggest that you begin by changing into your directory that you just created. If you didn't choose my-app as your folder name, then obviously choose whatever your folder name is. And once you're in that directory, you can run npm start. So you can see on my machine, I did that. I went cd into my app, and then I ran npm start. Sometimes this command can take a little bit of time to get everything up and running, but once you do, you should see something that looks like this in your terminal. If you remember back when I showed you how to run React locally just using those CDNs and the VS Code extension called Live Server, well, now we're essentially replacing that. You won't need to click anything in your VS Code using Live Server, but instead you're running your development environment through the terminal. In fact, after you run this command and it says compiled successfully, it will probably open a browser window for you and direct you to localhost :3000 automatically. And when that opens, you'll probably see the default Create React App screen, which looks something like this. So where exactly does this screen come from with the React logo? Well, this is a boilerplate version of the Create React App code that is automatically built in this new React app that has been spun up for you. If you really just want to start from scratch, what I recommend doing is just taking all of the files in the source folder. You can see I've highlighted them all here in my VS Code and just deleting them. And then you can just start from scratch the same way we have been so far by creating an index.js file and writing the code that we're used to writing. One thing to note here is that you don't need to create your own index.html. That is being handled inside of this public folder. And of course, I recommend poking around the code just to better understand exactly what's going on, but you'll see that inside that public folder, there's an index.html file that has a div with the ID of root in it. So inside the new index.js file that you create, you can already select that element by the ID of root when you're using React DOM.render. And it's a bit small in this screenshot, but you can see that it's rendering an H1 that just says, hello, create React app. And in the browser that popped up automatically on localhost 3000, it updated automatically for me. Now, usually any changes that you make to your code, when you hit save, it will automatically refresh your browser. Every now and then, I found that that becomes a little disconnected and you just have to go to your browser and hit refresh. But either way, it should update your browser to reflect what you have written in the code. And that's it, you're all set. Now, as we continue to go through this course here on Scrimba, I still highly recommend that you do the challenges I give you right here inside of the Scrimba environment. One of the huge benefits of Scrimba is that the environment is already interactive and it's already set up for you. And so the barrier to getting your hands on the keyboard, typing the code, practicing React is very low. So although you now know how to set up a local environment, please don't feel like you need to do that every time you're going to do one of the challenges that I give you, because honestly, in this course, we're not practicing how to set up React apps. We're practicing how to write React and build cool applications with React. But now you have the knowledge you need if you feel like jumping away from what we're doing in the course and just practicing your own thing and being creative, being curious, and building whatever you want to build without necessarily having to deal with the Scrimba environment. And then, of course, when the time comes to deploy your projects to a real website, well, you're going to have something local on your machine that you can push up to GitHub and to whatever host you're pushing it to. Okay, sorry that was such a long aside. Let's jump right back into the course and continue to learn. I am coming to you from the future because you can see in the background we have our React Facts static site almost completely built out, but there's an issue for anyone who is going to be using Create React App to follow along with some of the projects that we will work on. And namely, those issues are when we need to load CSS styles and when we need to load images in Create React App. In Scrimba, this will just kind of work out of the box. But if you're using Create React App to follow along, you might notice that, well, your site's going to look something like this. Not only are the styles missing, but also our image link is broken. Fortunately, these are relatively easy fixes. You can go to the React docs to check out this adding images, fonts, and files. It also has a link to dealing with CSS in there as well. You can actually click on the screenshot to go straight there, but I'm going to show you what this looks like in VS Code. So if you are using Create React App, it's generally recommended that you put your styles inside of your source folder. There's much more in-depth ways to also organize your styles on a per component basis, but for now, we're just going to assume you have one global style.css, and that's going to live again inside the source directory. And the Webpack instance that's running Create React App behind the scenes is using something called Style Loader that allows you to just import the styles directly into your index.js. This might seem a little weird to just be importing a string that represents a CSS file, but Webpack is set up behind the scenes to make this work fine. The main issue is that when you build your project, it's going to build in a way that doesn't have a ton of different files and folders inside your source directory. Instead, Webpack is going to bundle everything up into one giant JavaScript file. And that JavaScript file is going to live near index.html. And essentially, in the end, you'll have an index.html, an index.css, and an index.js files. That's nothing that you have to do manually. It's just going to happen behind the scenes for you. I think that will make more sense when we look at fixing our image issues, but right now, by simply importing our style.css, we get our React Facts site back to an almost perfect condition. You can still see that our logo icon in the upper left is broken. So loading images, we do something relatively similar. In the code behind me here, you'll see that we have a navbar component, and in that we are able to set the source directly equal to a string that has a path to the image that we need to exist in the navbar. However, because this path is relative to where the navbar.js file currently lives, this is going to break when things get bundled up into that one giant index.js file like I mentioned. So anytime you have an image that you want to include on your site, you will likely want to put your images inside the source directory. And then instead of hard coding the path directly into our image source, we're first going to import our image from that path that's relative to where the navbar.js file lives. And we import it with some kind of name. We can call it whatever we want. I've chosen React Logo in this case. And then once we've done that, we simply replace our source with React Logo. That way, when Create React App is bundling up this project, it essentially has a reference to where that image file exists relative to the current file, and it can create a better absolute path when everything gets bundled up so that there isn't a broken link between your component and the image that you're trying to use. And once we do that, we have our logo back and running, and everything else about this page is looking good. Now, there is another way to solve this problem, and that is to put your styles and your images inside of the public folder instead of inside of the source folder. However, this is sort of gently advised against. If you go to the documentation, there's a whole page dedicated to using the public folder, but if you read carefully, it says there's a lot of benefits to not using the public folder, but if you really need to, you can, and here's how. You can click the screenshot here to go read more about that if you'd like. Okay, hopefully that answers some of your questions if you've been trying to follow along with Create React App on your local machine. If not, and you're just working here in Scrimba, you essentially don't need to know any of this until it comes time to start using Create React App on your own machine. But either way, it's good information to know because eventually you won't be just working here in the Scrimba environment. With that said, let's go back in time and we'll jump right into this project. One thing that I really like to do when I'm starting a new project, especially if I have the design right in front of me like we do here, is to make a sort of mental outline of the elements on the page and how I'm going to lay this project out. All that really helps me do is to make a sort of mental model of how I'm going to create everything on the page. This can be especially helpful when you're thinking about layout and how you're going to place certain elements in the right spot on the page, especially when you start thinking in terms of using Flexbox or Grid to do that kind of layout. So as a first sort of mini challenge, what I want you to do is pause the screencast and look at this page, try to determine what kind of elements you would use, what kinds of CSS layouts you might use. Fortunately, this project has a fairly simple layout, but I still think that it's something that will be helpful for you to practice. So pause the screencast and try to imagine what elements you would use and how you would lay them out for this project. There's certainly more than one way to lay out any given page, but the way that I see this is having two primary sections. The top section, which is sort of a nav bar, and the bottom section, which is sort of the main content. Inside that nav bar, we have a little React logo, the React Facts logo text up here, and then a little blurb about what project this is in this course. Already, I can start to see that I'm probably going to choose to lay this out with Flexbox because that's a really easy way to make sure everything's in a nice, neat line. And with Flexbox, all I need to do to push this text all the way to the right is to give an auto margin to my React Facts text here, or rather a margin right of auto so that it pushes this React Course Project 1 text all the way to the right side of my navigation bar. Then down below, it looks like I just have an H1 and an unordered list with some list items. So with this kind of mental outline, I can start putting together what the actual elements will look like on the page. I usually end up creating some kind of container div, so we'll call it a div with the class of container, and this will just surround my whole page. And then we have our main two sections, that nav bar, which we saw at the top, and the main section. Inside the nav bar, we had a couple elements like the image, and then maybe let's call the React Facts text an H3, and this React Course Project 1 an H4. And then in the main section, there was our H1 and an unordered list with some list items inside. Now, in terms of React, this can be a really helpful exercise because I can start to see that I will probably have two main components. First, a custom nav component, which will house my nav element with its children elements. And second, a main custom component, which will house my H1 and my unordered list with the list items. In terms of those nested items, like the image in H3, those are going to be simple enough that they won't need their own custom React component. And then I would take my custom nav component and my custom main component and probably collect them together in one more custom component, which I usually end up calling app. And that will be what renders my div with the class of container. And then that app component, since it contains all the elements on my project, will then be rendered with React DOM.render. So I hope this has been a helpful exercise for you, at least to see the way that I usually like to break down my projects. If it's a layout that's fairly basic like this, I usually will just kind of think about it ahead of time without actually writing it down or putting a bunch of dotted squares around the elements or anything like that. But once you've practiced this enough times, a simple layout like this might take you a total of maybe 10 seconds to think through, but in the end could end up saving you a lot of time. So now it's time for us to get your hands on the keyboard. We're going to have a series of challenges, which will help you be the one that actually builds out this project. Hey there, I'm jumping in at this point to let you know that I've created a very quick Figma tutorial. Throughout this course and many others here on Scrimba, we're going to be providing you with a Figma design file, and I do think you'll find Figma fairly intuitive, but I thought it would be a good idea to just record a quick tutorial to help you along. The first thing you'll have to do is go over to figma.com and create a new account. And as I was signing up for a second account just to kind of test this process, I realized that there's actually a lot of steps, so I figured I would walk you through it. First, you're going to click sign up. You'll obviously either sign up with Google or you can provide an email and password. I believe if you provide an email and password, it will have you go verify your email, so it'll send you an email to verify. Once you've done that and you come back, it will have you choose which kind of plan you want. Figma has a really generous free tier, so I would just start for free. You'll click that button down there. When it asks you to tell you about your team, you can, at this point, honestly just say skip this step. And then when it says, what would you like to do first? I just think it's easiest to say, I'll explore by myself. And when you do that, it's going to drop you into the Figma interface. Now, from that point on, I've actually recorded a whole tutorial using the Figma program that is now over on the Scrimba YouTube channel. So at this point, you're going to continue onto YouTube by clicking on the screenshot here, which will take you to the video that I recorded. And hopefully that quick introduction to Figma will really help make things easier for you as you use Figma as a part of your Scrimba coursework. So click on the screenshot you see here, head over to YouTube. When you've watched that video and you're done, you can close that window, come back here to Scrimba and continue on in this course. Let's start by getting some of the project setup out of the way. I've written some step-by-step instructions here in the challenge. It is going to be a little bit more involved because we're creating everything completely from scratch, or almost completely from scratch. So your challenge is to create a components folder, and this components folder is going to have two files in it, the navbar.js file and the main.js file. For now, they should just render an H1 that says something like navbar goes here and main section here. Then I want you to create an app component, which will be outside of the components folder, and have the app component render the navbar and main components that you just created. Then inside of this file, the index.js, you will import the app component and then use React DOM.render to render that. The last step is to go and get the Inter Google font, specifically with the weights of 400, 600, and 700. Once you've selected those font weights, you should see a series of link tags that you can use to put inside of our index.html. Make sure to put them above style.css so that we can reference them in style.css. And if you haven't used Google Fonts before, this one might take a little bit of extra research outside of Scrimba here to learn more about. But I know that you can do it. Fortunately, Google Fonts makes it relatively easy. Just know that you can ignore the @import or any npm options it talks about for installing this font. Remember, we're not dealing with any kind of styling right now, so by the end of this challenge, you'll just have a basic white page that just shows navbar here and main section here, or something like that. So pause now and work on this challenge. Okay, let's just go one step at a time. We'll first create a new folder called components. And inside components, we can create a new file for main.js and navbar.js. As always, we will import React from React, and we will export default our navbar function, our navbar component. And for now, this is just going to return an H1 that, let's have it say navbar component. Then our main.js is going to be almost identical. We'll just copy this, paste it in, and instead of navbar component, we'll say main component, and we'll call this element the main element. Okay, I'll hit save. This is just going to bring up my preview window, but that's still empty. So I need to create a new file called app.js. And inside of app.js, again, we'll import React from React. We'll also import our navbar component from ./components/navbar. And we'll do the same thing for main, so I'll just duplicate that line and change navbar to main. Then this app component, we will export directly here with export default function app. And we will just have this return, well, we want our navbar to be in here, so we'll say navbar, and we want our main component to be in here. But I want you to think for a second, what's wrong with the way that I've done this? We can see there's a syntax error. So what's wrong with the way that I've set this up? Inside of components, we can only return a single element. That element can have children elements, but right now we're trying to have two sort of side-by-side components. So what we need to do is wrap those in some kind of container like a div. So I'll move this div around and indent those. If you remember from the last screencast, we talked about how this would probably just be set up as a container. So we'll give it a class name of container. We're not going to deal with any styling now, but I might as well add that class name since I know I'm going to need it. Okay, let's go check out our challenge and see where we are so far. So I created a components folder. I created the navbar and main components already. I created my app component, which is rendering the navbar and main components. So here we are. Let's import and render the app component here. I will import app from ./app. Oh, and I am going to be using some JSX syntax, so I also need to import React from React. And in our index.js, I will also be using React DOM. So I need to import React DOM from React DOM. And then I'll use React DOM.render to render my app component, which I just imported. And we're going to put it inside of the element with the ID of root. So we'll use document.getElementById root. And let's hit save and see if we get our elements showing up on the page. Awesome. Navbar component, main component, just like we expected. Okay, so that completes this part of the challenge. And then the last thing was to go to Google Fonts to get the Inter font. Hopefully this wasn't too terribly tricky. Going to Google Fonts will give you a couple link elements. So I'm just going into my index.html, and above my style.css, I will just paste in those link elements. You can see that we have this pre-connect to Google Fonts, this one to gstatic, but then this one is for our actual fonts. Here you can see the font family is Inter, and it shows our weights of 400, 600, and 700 there. Again, I'm putting this above my style.css so that inside of my style.css, I can reference the font family of Inter, and my browser will have already read these other link tags to know exactly what the Inter font is. Okay, let's go back here, and we have finished everything from this challenge. I'll just do a little bit of cleanup. Now, we did just cover a lot of ground. However, every step that we did here was something that you should have already been able to do, maybe with exception to the Google Fonts if you've never dealt with Google Fonts before. So if you did find yourself struggling to get some of this basic setup done, that might be a good signal to you that it's time to go back and restudy and especially repractice some of the past challenges that we've done instead of just kind of plowing ahead in this course. The reason for that is because I'm essentially going to assume that you understood how this works from here on. And the last thing that I would want for you as you're learning React is to just continue on without actually having learned some of these basic setup principles. Okay, let's jump into maybe something a little more fun, and that is adding some actual styling and elements to our project. But before we move on, I wanted to give you one more opportunity to access the Figma design file. We talked about this much earlier in this section, but since it's been a while, I figured this would be a good reminder. If you click on the screenshot here, it will take you to the Figma file where you can get access to the design elements for this, like the colors, the spacing, the fonts, and everything like that. When you click on this link, it will take you to a shared version of this. However, if you'd like, you can avoid seeing everyone else's cursors and selections by clicking on the little arrow at the top and choosing to duplicate this to your drafts. That'll make it so that you aren't seeing everyone else's cursors and selections, but also so that you can make changes to it if you'd like. Okay, let's do it. Let's jump right in and start working on the navbar portion of our project. Okay, this is the fun part. We're actually going to make our navigation bar look the way that it looks in the design. A couple pieces of advice. I highly recommend you reference the Figma file that contains all of the fonts, colors, spacing, and everything instead of just looking at this quick reference that I've put here, but this is meant to be just a quick reference for you if you need it. Another thing is I have added a couple of base styles to our styles.css. I ran into some problems trying to record this without putting my box sizing, and just because it helps a lot, I'm going to remove the margin on the body, especially to make our navigation bar go all the way to the edges. Also notice that I have included the React icon small image here inside of the images folder. You can see that's part of the design up here in the upper left. So without further ado, pause the screencast and make the navigation bar look as close to our design as you can. All right, let's do this. Instead of rendering an H1, I'm going to open this up and render a nav element because this is a navigation bar. And inside of there, we know we have an image. We'll give it its source while we're here. I have to use /images because I'm inside of the components folder when I'm here in the nav bar. And it's React icon small.png. Let's just refresh and see if that's working. Okay, cool. And let's call this maybe an H3, I guess, and maybe this an H4. It really doesn't matter because, well, you could just give it a class name and call it a paragraph, but I'll just call it an H3 and H4. This one says React Facts, and this one says React Course-Project 1. Okay, refresh that, and we've got our elements on the screen. Now, we talked about earlier how the navbar will probably be a Flexbox container. So I think because I'm only going to have one nav element on my screen, I'm just going to style the element nav. If you want, you could always give it a class name as well. I'm going to put display flex. We'll say align items in the center. From the design, we can find that the background color is this color here. It also looks like it has about 30 pixels of padding on the top and bottom and 25 pixels of padding on the left and right. And we can also see from the design that it has a height of about 90 pixels. Okay, so it doesn't look like our top and bottom margin is applying, and I suspect that's either because our image is a little bit too large, or I think maybe more likely because our H3 and H4 here have some top and bottom margin by default. So I think I might just select the H3 directly inside of the nav. Let's say margin is 0, and then let's see if that also works for the H4. Okay, it might be that the image is just a little too large. Let's take a look at the image, and it looks like from the design it's got a height of about 30 pixels. Okay, so maybe our padding is doing fine, and it was just that the image was a little bit large. While we're here dealing with the image, I'm going to give it a margin right, just to bump it away from the text there a little bit. We'll say, I think the design shows it's about 7 pixels. That looks pretty good. And let's go ahead and use the margin right of auto on our H3 just to bump that H4 all the way to the right side. Cool. All right, well, while we're working on that, we can go ahead and give the color to our React Facts. So we'll say the color is this color from the design. Okay, that does it for the color. Let's get the fonts right. And actually, I think all of the fonts on this page are Inter, so I'm just going to change that in the body. We'll say Inter, and then I think a backup of sans serif makes sense. Let me just comment this out. Yeah, okay, so that's making a difference. So awesome. Our Google fonts are coming through just fine. I can also see from the design that the React Facts logo words there have a font weight of 700, so we'll bold those up a little bit, or maybe that's the default. Doesn't look like it's making much of a difference. And then let's do the same thing for our H4. It has this color from the design, and it looks like it has a font weight of 600. Okay, that's making a slight difference, so that's good. And it kind of looks to me like React Facts maybe needs to be a little bit bigger. And yeah, I can see from the design that it has a font size of something around 22 pixels. Okay, that's looking awesome. Now, when I can avoid it, I usually don't love to style things with their native components if I don't have to. Maybe just for practice sake, I'm going to go into my navbar and I'll start providing some class names here. So let's give a class name to everything on the page. Let's go class name equals, and then up here, maybe I'll use something kind of like BEM syntax. I'll say this is part of the nav block and the element is the icon. And then we'll say this is the nav block and the element is it's kind of like the logo text. And this one is part of the nav, and let's call it maybe like the title of our project here. And what's nice about that is I don't have to do these kind of nested selectors anymore. My H3 was nav logo text, and I can also select my nav title and change these other selectors as well. And oh, one thing I've learned about Scrimba is I have to make sure I save this when I change my class names before I come to the CSS. Otherwise, the CSS updates live, but the markup does not. So once I hit refresh there, that kind of put everything back the way it was. Awesome. This is a really excellent start. Frankly, most of what we did here was just CSS instead of actually doing React. But my goal with this course is not just to focus entirely on React. I want to synthesize some of the information you have been learning so far, including revisiting the CSS and markup and stuff like that as much as we can. Frankly, in this first section of the course, we aren't doing much of the detailed side of React. We mostly have just learned some of the very basic syntax. But I think it's important for us to kind of remind ourselves of the past information we've learned by practicing it here. So the next thing we're going to do is fill out the body section here, or the main section here. There's a couple of gotchas with this that we're going to actually address later. But whenever you feel good about everything we've done here in this challenge, then let's move on to the next one. Okay, let's work on this main section here. I do want you to skip two aspects of the design right now. We're not going to worry about changing the colors of these bullets, and we're not going to worry yet about adding this logo over here to the right. Everything else, though, is fair game for this exercise, so pause the screencast and work on this task. All right, let's go ahead and make this into a main element. This is another semantic HTML element, and it represents the main section of our app here, so we will call it that. And it looks like it really only has two elements in it. It's got this H1 and an unordered list with 5 list items. So that should be relatively straightforward. And it says fun facts about React. We have our unordered list. And I'm going to hit Option Shift down to create copies of those so I don't have to type them out manually every time. And then I will actually go ahead and just copy and paste the text from the Figma file, so you don't need to sit and watch me do that. All right, let me move this over just a tiny bit. And let's hit refresh. Okay, that's a good start. Let's get some of the design aspects going here. I've got my main element, and I think I feel okay styling that as the main element because I will probably only have one. Well, I know that I'll only have one. And we will give it a background color, which we can go ahead and grab from the Figma file. Okay, and well, this highlights some issues here. Now, I haven't set up my body or my main element to be a full height, and it looks like maybe it's a collapsing margin. I'm guessing this H1 has a margin on top, which is causing this whole section to collapse down below. So let's give, first of all, the main section a height of, let's try 100%. Yeah, sometimes that doesn't work. Maybe if I give my body a height of 100 view height. And let me refresh this. Well, okay, you know what? I think this is highlighting another problem that I was planning on addressing later. So for now, what I'm going to do is actually move this background color to the body so that it does cover everything. Okay, and that'll be a good enough start. We'll fix this a little bit later, but it did highlight the fact that what we had here is our main section is not taking up the entire body here. In a couple of screencasts from now, we'll see why that's a problem, but for now, I'm just going to put my background color on the body. Okay, and I probably actually don't need this height of 100% right now. We'll come back to that later. Oh, however, I do want to give it some padding, and it looks like from the design I have about 55 pixels. It says 57. We'll just go ahead with 57 on the top and bottom, and then about 27 pixels on the left and right. And well, you know what, I think that margin, this looks a little too much. I'm going to guess that the margin of my H1 here is a little bit high. Let me just check that. If I set this to margin 0, yeah, that normalizes it a little bit more. So instead of selecting all H1s, let's go here and give this a class name. And similar to the last one, I'll say this is the main block and it's the title element. And that way I can be a little more specific about which H1 I want. And again, I need to refresh this in order for that class name to apply. And awesome. Okay, the sizing is looking good. Let's get our color correct. Now our H1 here also has a font size of about 39 pixels. And everything else needs to be white. Maybe I'll just color the entire section here. Yeah, that'll work. Okay, awesome. Well, now that I have removed the margin from my title, it looks like my unordered list is bumping a little bit close to my title. Rather than giving my title a margin bottom to push it down, I personally prefer to have elements push themselves away from other elements, if that makes any sense. And when I see this, I think of the unordered list as being too close to the H1 as opposed to the other way around. That might not make any sense. That's just how my mind is working. I'm going to give my unordered list a class name. Let's say this is main dash dash, we'll say facts. And we will select our main facts, and I'll give it a margin top of, it looks like the design says 46 pixels. Okay, now actually I just looked at the Figma file and noticed that our title actually has a slight change to the letter spacing. So I'm just going to copy and paste that here, and yeah, that compresses our H1 a little bit, actually quite a bit. So we will go ahead and leave that there. Sometimes these rules like this are really easy to overlook if you aren't looking closely in the Figma design. Something that's really nice is I can actually just copy all of the rules if I need to and paste them here, and then I can decide which ones are actually making a difference or are necessary. Now, I already have that one. I can just comment these out. This one's technically making a slight difference. I'm not terribly worried about it. The font size we already specified. Font weight of bold is already the default, font style of normal, and so forth. I can get rid of some of these as well. But we can see this one actually did make quite a bit of a difference, so it's good that we put it in there. Okay, now these are really close together, so I'm going to select all of the list items under main facts. I'm doing this just so I don't have to give a class name to every single LI or give the same class name to every single list item there. And actually, let's go ahead and do the same thing I did before. I'm just going to copy some of these font styles that we have inside of Figma and see if any of them made a difference. I don't need that. That's not making a difference. That's already the default. That's already the default. That makes a tiny difference. Maybe I'll leave it in there. It did separate them a little bit. I'm guessing, however, I'm going to have to apply some padding to these. So let's give a little bit of padding. There's a relatively new CSS property called padding block that allows me to only specify the padding on the top and bottom in one go. Let's start with 10 pixels and see how that looks. And yeah, that looks fairly accurate. Another thing I'm noticing is that the text is actually wrapping around here and mine is not. It's going all the way to the right. This probably isn't much of a problem. If I did want to fix that, I could probably just apply a max width on my list items. That way it's not taking up the entire left to right. maybe something like 400 pixels. And yeah, that seems to wrap it a little bit. And awesome, this is a great start. We're only missing two minor things. We're going to change these colors of these bullets to be the same color as our logo up here, and we're also going to add this little React logo over here to the right. However, both of these have a little bit of a gotcha to them, so I thought it could be good to do them each as a separate assignment, and that is what we're going to cover next. Originally, my plan was to give you a challenge to color the bullets and make them just a little bit larger like we have in the design. However, as I was researching this, I came across a relatively new CSS property, or rather pseudo selector, that makes this challenge extremely easy. So just this once, you can sit back and relax. I'm going to show you just how easy this is. There's a little bit of a gotcha with it, but I included a slide here that shows you the MDN docs for the marker pseudo element. And believe it or not, this very specifically selects the bullets on list items. And even look at this example. It's changing the color and it's making it a little bit larger with its font size. That's exactly what we want to do. You can click this slide to go check out the docs, poke around these allowable properties, and of course, you should probably play with this a little bit, but fortunately, this is a really easy thing for us to implement. I'm just going to copy this and add my pseudo element selector for marker. One thing to keep in mind is that this is not accepted by all browsers. However, Safari, Firefox, and newer versions of Chrome have all adopted the marker pseudo element selector, and I'm certain as time passes, this is going to become even more widely accepted, and therefore I feel pretty confident using this method for accomplishing this task. So, simply enough, I can change the font size to, let's say, something like 1.4 rem, and sure enough, that made our bullets a little bit larger. Now, as I was playing with this, I noticed that if we get too large, let's say 3 rem, things become pretty misaligned. And at least at this time, when I was researching, I could not find a good way to realign these bullets with the text. So in my playing around, I found that 1.4 made the bullets larger without getting them misaligned with the text. So for now, we have that limitation. I'm just going to work within that and say the font size is 1.4 rem. It's not quite as large as what we have here, but that's okay. And then again, simply enough, I'm just going to go take the color of our text here. This is the blue color that we want, and stick it right here as our color. And sure enough, we have the blue color on the bullets. Easy peasy. Well, I hope you didn't become too comfortable letting me do all the work, because in the next screencast, we are going to add this logo. And by we, I of course mean you, in a challenge. So that's what we'll do in the next screencast. I actually debated a little bit whether or not I should include this as a real challenge for this section, only because it touches on some CSS that you may not be super familiar with. But in the end, I settled on remembering that you guys are capable and you can use Google to your advantage just like a real developer. So here it is. I decided to add it in. Your challenge is to place that gray React logo in the background. We have that logo here under images as React icon large.png. Something important to know about this icon is that it is actually half of the React logo. It looks from the design like maybe it's a full React logo that's just bleeding off the page, but if you look closely, once you put this React icon large on your actual page, you'll notice that it's only half of a logo. At first, that threw me off. That just had to do with the way that I exported it from Figma. Honestly, I think it makes our job a lot easier as we're placing it on the page. So just keep that in mind as you move forward. One last little piece of advice I'll give you is to add this background image to the main element. It probably would work just fine to add it to the entire body element, but I'm going to be doing it to main, so you might as well do it to the main element as well. Again, Google is a developer's best friend, so don't be afraid to use Google while you're trying to solve this challenge. Pause now and work on adding this background image. Okay, hopefully you found this wasn't actually that big of a deal. So I'm going to add first the background image to my main element here. I'm going to use the URL function so I can specify the location for these images. This is relative to my style.css file, so I'm going to say /images/react icon large.png. Okay, and we see that it automatically is repeating around the entire page, so that's where the background repeat comes in, and we want to say no repeat. Of course, here by default, it puts it in the upper left of our page, or rather the main element. And this is where background position comes in. Now, background position is actually a combination of background position X and background position Y. In fact, let's start out there. We can say background position X, that's my position to the left and right. I want to push it all the way to the right. This is where having half of a logo becomes pretty handy for us because it automatically looks like it's bleeding off the side of the page. And then with background position Y, we can specify something like top, which is where it is now, or bottom. Bottom, I think, is a touch too low, although center is maybe a touch too high. I can also use percentages, so we can split the difference and say something like 75%. And now that we've seen these as two separate properties, I actually can just combine these and say background position, which is background position X, and then I'll use a space and then Y of 75%, and that simplifies it a bit. If I really wanted to, I could use the shorthand background property, which would be background, and then I would just copy and paste this one first, space, this one, space, this one. Honestly, I always forget what the background property is short for, so I'm actually going to leave these as three separate properties so that in the future it's really easy for me to remember what each of those pieces means. And awesome, this represents a culmination of everything that we've learned so far about React. Let me go ahead and clean up this challenge. Now, of course, we've been spending a bit of time in CSS land here, and as I've mentioned, I still think that's a really important thing to do. Even though our main focus in this course is to learn React, it's really important to synthesize some of that other information that you have learned in the past so that it doesn't become stale to you and you just forget it. That being said, in the next screencast, let's spend some time looking back at everything that we did learn about React, because that's actually what we're here to learn. And at the same time, we'll take that opportunity to have a quick quiz and to look at a self-assessment project that you can do on your own. So that's what we'll be doing next. You've done a great job so far in this course. Before you just plow ahead to the next section, it's time for a solo project. This is meant to be a chance for you to flex your new React skills that you've been learning about so far in this section, but this time without the training wheels. And there's going to be a few of these throughout this React course, and these projects serve a really important purpose. They're meant to be a tool for you to gauge whether you are actually ready to keep moving forward in the curriculum or not. Unlike the challenges that I usually give you, I won't be walking you through a solution to this one. Instead, I'm going to be asking you to sort of go out on your own to build this project. That said, you're not actually completely on your own. We've got a thriving community here on Scrimba that's very willing to give feedback on your code. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, but first I want you to keep in mind that no one here is giving you a grade for these projects like they would if you were in school. One of my personal objectives is to shift people's understanding of how learning occurs. In school, we're trained to complete the project for the grade. But here, you're completing the project to test yourself and to practice. So skipping one of these solo projects will really only deprive you of the best chance you have to test out your skills and to really help you decide if you grasp the concepts that we've been learning so far. Okay, with that guilt trip behind us, let's actually take a look at what we're building. For this project, you're going to be building a digital business card. Everything here is static, and you can see there's actually two different designs that you can choose from. In fact, if you click the screenshot, it will send you to the Figma design file. You'll see that there's actually more designs, including a light mode version of these designs. And what you can do is just choose the one you like the best and build that one. When you get to that design file, make sure to click the little arrow at the top and choose to duplicate to your drafts. And as far as actually coding the project goes, I recommend that you just build your project here in Scrimba. On this screencast, if you look in the very lower right, you'll see a menu with 3 dots. If you click that, there's an option to fork this screencast to a new scrim. Doing that will make a duplicate of this project that you will have in your own account so that you don't have to worry about losing your work. You can see I really didn't give you a whole lot to work with here. We have a very basic HTML file that has our div with the ID of root, an empty index.js file, some very basic styles, and the 2 dependencies that you'll need to get React set up. Okay, let's come back to the requirements of this project. First of all, I want you to be building this project from scratch, which is why I'm not giving you any starter code at all. Next, and probably pretty obvious, I want you to fill in your own information for the digital business card here. And while you're building it, I want you to make separate components for the info section, which is what I'm calling this whole top half up here. The about section, which is really just this header and a paragraph. The interest section, which is another header and a paragraph. And a footer section, which has the social icons. While you're working on this solo project, make sure to share your work. In fact, you don't even need to wait until you're completely finished with the project. You can be asking for code reviews and help all along the way. If you click the Discord icon here, it will open the Scrimba Discord server specifically to a channel called I Built This, but in reality, you can share your project in any of the channels that make sense to do so in. And then for anyone who is learning in public and likes to use Twitter, you can click this Twitter icon, which will open Twitter and pre-populate a new tweet where you can include a link to your project so that you can share it to the world. Okay, I wish you the best of luck, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone's projects. Awesome job building some of your first React projects. I know that these are just static sites, and so far you're really not seeing the benefits of using React to build these kinds of projects. But now that we have some of the basic React syntax under our belts, we're ready to start dipping our toes into a few of the really neat features that React has to offer as a framework. But first, let's take just a minute to recap what we've worked on so far in this section. In the beginning, it can be really helpful to know why we even care about React in the first place. We learned about how it is composable and declarative, what those terms mean, and how that's beneficial to us as web developers. Then we learned about the JSX syntax and how that allows us to write code that's much more familiar to us because it looks like we're writing HTML code inside of our JavaScript. Then we saw how we could actually apply the composable nature of React by creating our own custom components. For example, in our React Facts site, we created our own components for the main content of our page, but also for our navigation bar. Obviously, in this case, our navigation bar and our main sections are pretty simple, but hopefully you can imagine as your sites get more and more complex, how the ability to segment each of the pieces of your page into its own components can be a really beneficial thing. And soon we'll be really tapping into the power that comes with that as we learn more about React. Then we started learning about how we can style our projects because, well, obviously adding CSS is one of the key things that we need to make it look polished. Truthfully, there are a ton of ways to add styling to React. For now, we'll just be sticking with CSS classes because they're familiar, and all of these things combined have enabled us to create our own static pages in React. Like I mentioned, because we've only been working on static things so far, you might not yet be understanding why we're using React in the first place, but I promise we're going to get there and I promise it will be worth it. Before just moving on, you should celebrate your wins. Over in Discord, there is a Today I Did channel. If you click on the screenshot here, it will take you there, and you should let everyone know that you have just completed the first section of the Introduction to React. Also, this might be a good time to realize if you've been sitting down for too long or watching too much of this in one sitting, make sure you take a break. Your brain needs to rejuvenate itself, especially with all the new information you've been learning. So once again, congratulations on completing this section. You really should be proud of yourself. When you're ready to jump deeper into React, I will see you in the next section. Now that we've covered the basic syntax and concepts of building a static page in React, we're now ready to jump into the next phase, which is learning how to use data to create our web pages. In regular HTML and in the React code that we've done so far, all of the content that we're displaying on the page has been hard-coded directly into the React components. And it turns out this has some major limitations, which we'll be discussing in this section. First, let's look at the project that we just made. This little React Facts page, all of the data on this page was actually hard-coded directly into the components themselves. But now let's look at this section's project, which is a clone of the Airbnb Experiences page. Up near the top, we have some elements that are likely just hard-coded pieces of data. However, when you get toward the bottom and you have a list of different experiences, you can probably imagine that there isn't a developer sitting around waiting for a new experience to become available on the Airbnb website, and then immediately going into the code and updating this list to include that new experience. Instead, the data that's living in Airbnb's database is what will be driving the list that we see here. And once you start thinking in terms of components on a page that are actually being driven or displayed based on the data that underlies the page, you'll start to see this same architecture existing all over the web. Basically, any e-commerce site or page that has any kind of list on it is probably not using anything hard-coded into the code of the page, but instead is using the data that lives behind it to drive the content that exists on the page. If that's confusing at all, don't worry. We're going to dive into the specifics and see exactly what I'm talking about. Just like before, you can click on the screenshot you see here to go to the Figma design file for this section's project. And also, just like before, when you get there, you'll see a screen that looks similar to this. I'd highly recommend that you click on the drop-down arrow near the top, go down to Duplicate to your drafts, and choose this option to create an editable copy that will live in your own drafts instead of trying to use the one that is shared amongst everyone coming to this page. Once you click Duplicate to your drafts, you should see a little modal at the bottom that pops up that says that the file was duplicated to your drafts, which also includes a quick button that you can click to go directly there. And by the way, you can click any of these little screenshots to go to this design file as well. So let's see what we're going to be learning. The first thing that we'll be diving into is a concept called props in React. Props is one of the major topics in React that will help you create reusable and composable React components. And so we'll be spending a pretty good amount of time covering the concept and the syntax of props. And the other major topic we'll be covering in this section is how to create React components from an array of data. This is what will allow us to create those designs like in our Airbnb design here, where we have a list of items that we won't need to manually update anytime the data behind it changes. Now, before we jump into some of those more crucial topics in React, the first thing we're going to do is spend a bit of time creating the top half of our project here. And I'm going to say something that might shock a few of you, and that is that if you already feel very confident in doing styling in React like we did in the last few screencasts of the last section, I'm going to give you permission to skip the next few screencasts where we talk about designing the nav bar at the top and designing this hero section up here. Now, this isn't a free pass to just skip those sections. If you feel at all like you need additional practice using styling in React, I highly recommend you do not skip those practices. However, I did just want to warn you ahead of time that we will be spending a bit of time working on some of those design aspects before we jump into the main topics for this section. So again, click on the screenshot here to open it in Figma, create a copy in your own drafts, and then let's jump right in. We're going to start off this section as mostly a review of what we learned in the last section, which was how to create our own custom components. The way that we'll be reviewing that is by first building the top section of this project, which is really just static elements. You can see up at the top, we have a little navigation bar. Well, it's not even a navigation bar. It doesn't lead anywhere, but we'll call it a nav bar. And that's what we'll be working on in this first challenge. After this, we'll build this little photo grid and the text down here. And those will be two separate components, a navbar component and what we'll call a hero component. You can click on the screenshot you see here at any time to be sent to the Figma file in order to look for the design specifics. And because we already hammered it in the first section, I'm not going to have you build this completely from scratch. So let me walk you through what we have so far. In index.js, we're simply importing app and rendering app. Our app component is, well, basically as simple of a component as it could possibly be at this time. And this is also where your challenge is to build the navbar component. I've also included the Airbnb logo image as well as the photo grid image, which we'll get to in the next challenge. But in this challenge, the Airbnb logo is this little Airbnb logo in the navigation bar that you'll be working on now. The last couple things you'll notice is that I have the styling about as basic as it can be at this time, and I've also already imported the Poppins Google font that you'll notice is used in the design file. As such, when you're setting the font family, you can just say Poppins, but in this screencast, I don't think you need that. Yeah, this navbar doesn't have any text, it just has the image. Okay, let's go. Pause the screencast and build out our navbar component. I think what I'll do, even though this isn't going to be a particularly large application, I'm going to add a new folder called components. And that is where I will put my new navbar.js component. In navbar, I'm going to import React from React and export default my navbar function. I'm going to use the semantic nav element here. And the only thing we really have in here is an image, so I'll use the image element, and I'll provide the source, which will be /images, since I'm now inside of a components folder, /airbnb-logo.png. Okay, we have our component built. Obviously, this image is not sized correctly, so as soon as we get it displaying, it's going to look a little bit funny. But in our app.js, let's go ahead and import our navbar from /navbar, or actually it's /components/navbar. And then for our app component, let's, instead of rendering this h1, we'll put a div as our wrapper for the elements we put here, and we will render our navbar. Okay, again, I bet our logo is pretty huge. Yeah, that's much larger than we expect, but that's okay, because now we can turn to the CSS in order to style this. Because this app will be pretty limited in size and I'm only going to have one nav element, I'm just going to directly style the nav element. I can see from the design that it has a height of 70 pixels. And of course, that's not going to stop our image necessarily from expanding beyond the borders of that nav. However, in order to center that logo and get it over there on the left and everything, I think I would like to just make this a display flex. I think that's also going to, yep, our logo will be confined within the flex box because now it's a flex item and it's automatically resized to fit within its boundaries. If I add a little bit of background, let's just do something temporary. We'll say background color is blue. That lets me see exactly what I'm working within. And I bet if we just add some padding, we will get to resize that Airbnb logo a little bit smaller. Let's give it about 20 pixels on the top and bottom. Oh, that's already looking a lot better. And we'll say maybe 36 pixels on the left and right. That'll just bump it a little further to the right. Then if we look on the design, we can see that there's actually a box shadow on the bottom of this nav bar. It kind of helps separate it from the rest of the body. This isn't always a perfect way to go, but you can actually just copy that CSS directly from Figma and paste it. You can see when it was designed, it might not have been perfect. We have some weird decimal values here, but for now, I'm not going to be too concerned about that. It's a little difficult to see with our blue background, so let's get rid of our blue background. And awesome, we can see that's looking pretty good. One kind of strange bug I noticed when I was practicing this earlier is that on a Safari browser, this Airbnb logo will sometimes stretch the entire width for some reason of this navbar. So before I move on, I'm going to go to my navbar and give a class name to my image here. Let's call it nav-logo. And I'll hit save so that we can style that in our CSS. We will select nav-logo. And if I give it something like a max width of 100 pixels, that fixes the problem in Safari. Awesome. This is a great start to our app. In the next screencast, we'll pick up with another challenge and complete the hero section, which is right below. And that will conclude the review, at which point we can move on to the topics for this section. The next part of this review is for us to now build our hero component. That includes the photo grid, this H1, and this paragraph. To make things easy for the photo grid, I exported all of these photos as a single PNG, so you don't have to worry about laying out these images in a really cool way like this. Just as before, you can click this screenshot to go to the Figma design file for the specifics. The font being used is that Poppins font that we're pulling in through Google Fonts, so you can set the font family to Poppins. From a design perspective, you might also notice that this image grid is centered in its container, whereas the text is left aligned, although obviously there's this padding here. So your challenge is to build the hero component, pause the screencast, and work on this challenge. I'll work backwards this time. I'm going to duplicate my navbar line that I'm importing and change this to hero, even though this component doesn't exist yet. We'll do the same down here and render a hero. I'm not going to hit save because that's going to cause this to crash. Instead, let's go ahead and create our hero.js file. we will import React from React and export default a hero component. And first, let's get our bare element set up. I'm going to return, maybe we'll call this a section element since it's a section of our page. And we can see we have an image element, an H1 element, and a paragraph element. So I'll include those now. I'll go ahead and just paste in the text of these from the design file. Let's add our image source. And that'll be from ..images/photo-grid.png. And just like our logo, this is probably going to be a little too big for us. Yep. If I scroll down though, I can see some of this stuff popping up here. That's good. It's a good start. I'm going to set us up for some success with the CSS just by giving us some class names. Let's give the image a class name of maybe hero-photo. We'll do the H1 is a class name of, let's say, hero-header. And we'll do the same for the paragraph. Let's call it hero-text. I'll hit save, and then we'll go over to our styles so we can style some of these up. One thing that I've liked doing in the past is if I'm going to have a section that represents an entire section of my page, I just will style the entire section element or the section element directly and give it something like a padding of 20 pixels. That way, if in the future I want to use sections as, well, sections of my web page, it will automatically have the padding applied. Similar to what we did with our navbar, I think I want to make this section a display flex, but I'll have it be in a column direction. That'll make it really easy for me to center this photo grid, but keep these left aligned. I don't want to do that on all of my sections, however, so I think I'll go back to my hero and I'll give this section a class name of hero. And that way it's acting kind of like the hero container. And let's style our hero to be display flex with a flex direction of column. I have to hit save over here so that applies. Okay, that's already looking a lot better. I'm going to make this just a little bit bigger so we can see how it compares. One thing I noticed when I resized that is my image is growing probably infinitely to fit this container. Because I'm working in a fairly small space, I'm really only designing for mobile right now. But I think what I want to do is give my hero photo something like a max width of, it looks like in the design it's around 400 pixels. And we can see doing that is making it align to the left side there. So let's give this the flex item property of align self to the center. Okay, well, the only other thing I notice when I'm looking at the design is that my H1 and my paragraph are spread a little ways apart. Oh, and they're not the correct font family quite yet. So let's actually give the entire body a font family of Poppins, and we'll give it a backup of sans serif. And let's see. Oh, whoops, not popping, Poppins. Okay, and yeah, that's making a difference. Awesome. And then I'll come back down and I'm going to simply style my hero header. And let's specify a bottom margin. So margin bottom of, it looks like it's about 16 pixels in the design. And I think my paragraph might have some margin that's automatically applied. I'm just going to style my hero text to have a margin top of 0. Okay, those are sitting a little closer together, a lot like the design. Okay, I know that was a little bit lengthy to work on mostly CSS here, but like I said, I really think it's important to be synthesizing some of the past things that you've learned before they, you could say, atrophy or get stale and you just forget them. Especially as a front-end developer, there's almost no way to completely escape CSS if you hate it, and hopefully if you love it, then you really enjoy these reviews. So with this top half out of the way, now for the rest of this section, we'll be learning what we need to know in order to handle the bottom part of this app. So that's what we'll start doing in the next lesson. Let's jump right in and start building an instance of our card component. The main purpose of this exercise is to really illustrate how we're not quite yet prepared to build a series of components like we have down here. So for now, you're just going to build out one instance of our card. There's a few things that I've done for you. I've created, first of all, this card component. So you won't have to build this from scratch. And right now we're just rendering one instance of our card component. You'll notice too that I moved our hero out and commented it out. That's just so we didn't have to keep scrolling down in our app in order to see the progress that we're making. And let's go to Card.js and look at our challenge. Your challenge is to build out the card component. And for now, just hard code in the data for this first one with Katie Zephyrus. For some of the notes, only render one instance. I already did this for you. Also, the little star icon and the photo of Katie Zephyrus are here in our images. We have katiezephyrus.png and star.png. I just talk here about making sure to include all of the pieces of data that we have. And again, that the main purpose is to show that we have some limitations currently in our understanding of React. So don't worry about the fact that you're just hard coding all of this data into the card component for now. All right, it's time. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Okay, so when I look at the card component that we have in the design, I think what I'll do is make one div that will surround everything in the card, both the image and all of the data below. I'll probably put all three of these pieces of data and this little star image into its own div so that I can use Flexbox to make sure that they're all center aligned. And then I'll probably just put this Life Lessons with Katie Zephyrus in a paragraph and these prices here in a paragraph. I may end up putting this bolded section in a little span inside of that paragraph just to make it bold. If you were feeling adventurous, you might have put this little badge here. I'm going to ignore that badge for now. We're going to cover that a bit later. So let's get some of the elements on the screen here. We're not going to have an H1. Instead, we'll surround everything with a div. I think I'll go ahead and just give this a class name now of card because I already know I'm going to be styling this. The very first thing I have is an image, and we'll hardcode in our source. That's going to be in ./images/katiezephyrus.png. I'm sure this is going to be a bit large as well, so I'll go ahead and give this a class name. We'll say card-image. And then, like I mentioned, I think these elements here, we've got the star, the rating count, and the location all here in a line. So let's create a div. Maybe we'll call this a class name of card stats. And we'll put in our image, which will have the star.png as its source. Then I think just to get these other things in line, I'll use an inline element like span. So let's go ahead and create, I'm going to have 3 spans here. And remember, I'm just hard coding in some data. So we'll put 5.0. We had a parentheses with a 6. And I might actually just put my little bullet here as well. And then the location was USA. I guess let's hit refresh and see where we are. Okay, obviously some styling to handle, but at least things are showing up. After those stats, I think we just had 2 more paragraphs. So let's go ahead and create a couple paragraphs. We have Life Lessons with Katie Zephyrus. And here we had from 100, was it 136? I guess it doesn't really matter, per person. All right, let's see where we are. Okay, well, we have the elements on the screen. Let's start doing some styling here. I'll go over to Styles. First, I'll start off with my card, and it looks like from the design that it has a width of about 175 pixels. And while I'm here, I'm noticing that the text of this card is a little large. I think I'll just style all of that right here. We're going to say font size of, it looks like it's about 12 pixels. Okay, that's starting to look better. I had my card image, which is looking a little large. And in fact, the image is spanning outside of the boundaries of the card. So if I add a width of 100%, yeah, that's much better. And from the design, it looks like we also have a bit of a border radius. Looks like maybe 9 pixels. Awesome, the image is looking good. Then we had this div that contained our image and our 3 spans. I think we called that card stats. And like I mentioned, we're gonna make that display flex and use align items to the center. Okay, and my star is looking pretty huge compared to the other things. I can't remember if we added a class name to the star. Not yet. Let's go ahead and add a class name, and maybe we'll call it card -- star. Then I'll hit refresh somewhere so we can see those styles right away. Card star. It looks like the height is about 14 pixels. Okay, that's looking a lot more manageable. In the design, the review count of 6 here and the location are both in gray. I think what I'll do is actually just create a bare gray class that isn't specific only to this card, just because it seems like something I might want to do with a few other elements. So I will give both of these spans a class name of gray. And then since that's a little bit more of a generic style, I think I might move it up maybe just right here below the nav. We'll create a gray class and we'll just say that the color is the kind of grayish color from the design. So I just copied and pasted that straight from Figma. I need to go and refresh here. Okay, we have a bit of a light gray tint there. The only other thing I think I might do is change this to bold right now. That seems like another thing I might want to do elsewhere. If I just want to bold this text, I suppose I could surround it in a B tag or a strong tag. I think I'm going to actually surround it with a span so that I can style that span and just do that in line. We'll surround the from $136. We'll give that a class name. I think again, I'll make this generic. We'll just say bold. And in my styles.css, we'll add a bold class that sets the font weight to bold. And let me hit save over here. Awesome. Let's give ourselves a little more room. Okay, this is certainly looking good enough for now. Hopefully, as you were building this, you could start to see some of the limitations that we have with the way that we built it, especially by hard coding all of this data directly into the card component. So in the next screencast, let's start talking about what the problem is with the way we currently have this, and that will set us up perfectly to learn the solution to this problem. I assume many of you watching the last screencast were thinking to yourselves, okay, I'm creating this card component, but because I'm hard coding the data in, it's not going to be reusable. I've updated the Google slide to show you maybe a more realistic version of the design that we're looking for, because we're not just going to have the same experience with all of the same data inside. These kinds of repeated components are found everywhere online, and if you just start looking for them, you will see them everywhere. I pulled up screenshots from some of the first designs I could think of. In Amazon, every component or every product is going to have a repeated element. Here's IMDb that has something that looks relatively similar to what we're doing. And here's Apple, which has different product components, which really just have an image and a title, image, title, image, title. And you can imagine that when a new movie comes out to put on IMDb, there isn't a developer out there that is actually typing in new HTML or copy and pasting the HTML that they already created and then just changing out some of the data. But instead, these components are actually data-driven. On IMDb, for example, all they need to do is add a new movie to their database, which includes things like the cover image, the rating, the title, and so forth, and then the website will automatically update to include a new movie in its list here. We're going to cover the data aspect later, but for now, the main problem we have is that our component is so hard-coded that we can't really reuse it in any meaningful way. And in React, this is where the concept of props comes into play. Now, in my years of teaching React, I have found that props can be one of the more difficult subjects for students to grasp. And so what I plan on doing is taking the topic and just spreading it a little bit thin over a few different screencasts, and you'll get your hands on the keyboard and get to really practice with it so that you can understand the concept of props. So let's jump right in and get started. Let's start by understanding the basic concept of props in React. What you see here is just a plain index.html file. We haven't introduced anything dealing with React in this. I want you to take a close look at the elements that you see here and see if you can figure out what's wrong with them. Let's start with the anchor tag. An A tag, an anchor tag, is intended to link you to another place. But currently we don't have an attribute like the href specified. Without an href, this link is essentially useless. We need the href property in order for us to send someone to another page, maybe like google.com. Similarly, the image element is basically useless without any kind of source property. We need to add this source attribute or property in order to specify exactly what image will be here. We could put the path to a local file, or we could put the address of a file that's hosted somewhere on the internet. Input is interesting because I think on its own, it actually will put an input box that we could type into if we wanted to. However, there are attributes or properties that we can add to the input that will make it a lot more, let's say, beefed up or capable. For example, I can add a placeholder that says something like first name, and that suddenly makes the first name text appear inside of my element on the page. Or there's ones that have even more consequence to them, like the type property. If I change the type of this input to something totally different like submit, now it changes from an input text box to a button. Similarly, I could change it to radio and it completely changes the visual look of this input. These are concepts that I'm sure you're already very familiar with. Let's look at a similar parallel example in JavaScript. Here I've written a function that's called add two numbers together, and it just hard returns 1 and 2. Think for a second, what is wrong with this function? It's syntactically correct, but what's wrong with a function like this? Well, it's very, very limited in its capabilities. Right now, if I call add two numbers together, it will always return 3. Essentially, it's a useless function. Now, you might already see where I'm going with this. If I add some parameters, like let's say A and B, to this function, now I can dynamically add and return the result, or rather the sum, of the two numbers that I pass in. And with the small addition of these two parameters that I've added, I now have sort of beefed up this function in a way that it's capable of adding whatever two numbers I want, not just the hard-coded 1 and 2 that used to be there. Again, these concepts should be familiar to you by now, but this is just a primer for us to understand the concept of props in React. In both of these instances, in JavaScript and HTML, we can see that passing additional information to our maybe elements, or in this case, functions, allows us to reuse these elements or functions in multiple different ways. So with that primer under our belts, let's look at another conceptual parallel that is a little more visual. Let's try to understand props with a little bit more of a visual example. This is a screenshot taken from YouTube, and as you spend more and more time with a framework like React, you will begin to see these patterns of elements on the page that are repeated pretty much everywhere on the internet. For example, if you look here, you'll see that there are multiple components being displayed here, but all of them have essentially the exact same structure. They each have an image toward the top that takes up about half of the height of the component. Each of them has bolded text that represents the title. There's the view count showing the number of days ago that it was published. There's even little timestamps embedded inside of the image in the lower right. And as I've mentioned before, there certainly isn't a developer at YouTube that every single time a video is posted to YouTube, they go in, copy the code from an old tile, and paste it in again so that it can exist on the site. Instead, a developer has created a single component, maybe let's call it a video tile component, and has made that component flexible enough to take in as a property the image and the title, the view count, the number of days ago it was posted, who posted it, the timestamp, and so forth. And as you become more experienced in React and you start to see these patterns for yourself, you'll begin to realize that they can be nested inside of each other. For example, not only do we have repeated video tile elements here, but we have something that let's suppose is called a video list. Each one of these is made up as a parent-child relationship of video tiles. Even small things like on the left side of the page, you can see that these are probably individual components that are taking in properties to help them display something slightly different. In this case, it's probably just two elements. There's an image and there's some text. So that's probably enough of the conceptual. I think you're starting to understand the concept. Now let's go back to React and we'll start looking at how this is actually applied in code. Before we can continue on with props, we need to take a quick aside to talk about something. We've learned how our components will be returning JSX, which is a special syntax of JavaScript, or rather it's something that's created by React and allows us to write our React code in a very declarative way. However, one of the most common things that you'll find yourself doing is trying to insert values from JavaScript inside of your JSX. Right now we just have some text inside of our H1, but let's assume we had a value like first name. Maybe this is Joe and a last name. let's say Schmo. Think for a second, how would you change our H1 to no longer say hello world, but instead to say hello Joe Schmo? Well, we can probably see ahead of time that just trying to input first name, last name, or maybe even adding a space in there